The protagonist felt like she couldn't breathe. Suddenly, hands roughly grabbed her clothes and lifted her up. And then, that man furiously struck the young woman in the face, telling her that she had ruined his family's destiny with her recklessness. The man was outraged that she had tried to drown herself on the eve of her wedding. The protagonist looked at him bewildered when he called her Haley, but she didn't know who Haley was, because our heroine is named Kang E. Yeah. Her grandmother was already sick of hearing her granddaughter's oddities, so she asked her why she was doing it again. If there is no one here, the little one keeps seeing things and adults start thinking she is possessed. There is a spiritual shaman in Cheongnam, so the woman proposed sending the girl there. Well, he will surely help. Many did not understand how a god saved her, since the little one is so skinny and useless. Ji was abandoned by her parents right after birth and saw things she never should have seen. Grandma Johnson raised her, but the protagonist only lived by running errands. However, the girl was seeing this place for the first time now and had no idea about the man who was hitting her with such fury. But Ji understood. It is inside Haley. The protagonist did not feel the presence of the body's owner at all. Suddenly, all sounds abruptly ceased, and the girl froze. Haley's memories began to fly around her, one after another. But for some reason, they were all in the water. Now the protagonist understood. Haley threw herself into the water of her own free will. Over time, Haley's soul must have become a ghost or disappeared. She did not reincarnate, but rather occupied a dead body. Meanwhile, the man shouted even louder because the insolent brat was not paying the slightest attention to him. Considering the memories carried there, that man is Haley's father, Duke Duncan. He was furious that his useless daughter did not understand the enormous effort he had put into that engagement. A sudden voice and words about an unusual sight, spoken with a smile. They stopped the Duke. He threw his daughter far from him with all his might. Now the protagonist knew exactly how discipline was administered in the duchy. He ordered Duke Duncan to leave, as he needed to speak with his beloved fiancée. Her father remained still, so the young man approached and coldly ordered him to get out of there. That man appears in Haley's memories. He is her fiancé, the ruler of this country. But the girl, now Haley, had never seen so many vengeful spirits, which made her body tremble uncontrollably. She didn't understand what that man had done to be harassed like that. The young man tilted his head slightly and asked why she was trembling so much. Obviously, Haley couldn't be calm seeing all those horrifying ghosts next to the man. Meanwhile, the young man sighed tiredly and asked his fiancée to stop trembling in front of him, because he wasn't going to kill her. The heroine remembered that Haley had committed suicide the eve of her wedding, and that had caused a big scandal. She replied to her fiancé that his words made her tremble even more. Those words made the protagonist laugh. He lifted the girl's chin and explained that he had only come to talk, as they had barely exchanged a few words before. However, the protagonist didn't understand. Did the girl not desire this marriage so much that she decided to take her own life? She doesn't know the answer, because Haley's memories are not complete yet. The heroine does not want to die, so she answers hesitantly. It's not that I hate him. She was stunned, just as the fiancé asked if she still couldn't forget another man. In Kang E's life, this did not exist, but in Haley's it did. However, now her fiancé didn't care which man held her heart. He would like to support her sincere love, but the young man doesn't want history to remember him as an unhappy king. His words caused surprise and bewilderment on the protagonist's face. Meanwhile, the hero insisted on lifting Haley's chin and told her that, in his opinion, she should keep living. Although if she really wants to die, she should put on the crown first. The protagonist understood. It's that person who is unhappy wherever they go. The girl can see ghosts, and in the past was taken in by Grandma Johnson, a famous fortune teller. The grandmother, so that the spirits wouldn't cause harm, treated visitors with care, and she spared no words. Whenever she could, she told her granddaughter to avoid water. The heroine tried to ignore the spirits her whole life, until this moment, when she woke up in Haley's body. And then, she met a man who dragged a legion of spirits behind him. Now he was offering her to be queen, although in her previous life, Jai Jai only worked in a mountainous area. The spirits are watching her, which means they are waiting for an answer from the girl. You can't meet their gaze. Haley decided to dare to ask only one thing. If she refuses his proposal, what the hell will happen then? The ruler replied thoughtfully. The reason for the postponement was that the bride fell seriously ill. If Haley refuses now, it won't be a cold but a deadly illness. Well then, it will be time to die. The girl's reaction seemed amusing to the protagonist. Now Haley must answer whether she will throw herself into the water again or assess the situation sensibly. The protagonist shook her head. She was not going to give up her life. At least, as the fiancé said before she wears the crown, that won't happen. And that is what Haley could promise. The protagonist reflected on her words, but decided to trust. But her face said the complete opposite. It wasn't strange. Who would believe someone who almost died yesterday over something foolish? His Majesty, smiling, said that this time he would overlook his fiancée's mistake. Immediately after, he ordered Duke Duncan to be summoned at once. Shortly after, Haley's father returned to the room. He was furious about having to obey someone else's orders in his own mansion. The young man struck the floor with his scabbard and warned the Duke that there would only be one warning. His daughter will soon be Queen of Cayenne, just as the Duke wanted. That means he can no longer touch her as he pleases. But if the Duke raises his hand again, he had better first remember the face of his king. Haley was horrified by the evil aura surrounding her fiancé. The protagonist understood that he could really kill the Duke. The dark-haired man cursed mentally, feeling that familiar sensation. But he quickly controlled the emotions overwhelming him and asked the Duke what his response would be. The head of the Duncan family nodded against his will, accepting His Majesty's proposal. Haley couldn't believe it. If her fiancé were a normal person, he would have gone crazy, but he managed to suppress the spirits with his own power. The girl froze upon seeing the dark-haired man extend his hand to her. Only now did she remember that she was still kneeling, so she placed her hand in His Majesty's, accepting his help. But the hero did nothing more, and Haley had to get up by herself, not understanding her fiancé's actions. Suddenly, he took her hand and kissed it, asking her if 4 days would be enough to cure her cold. The scandal has already grown so much that waiting longer is impossible. Upon receiving the young woman's consent, His Majesty announced that this was his last act of grace towards the Duncan family. He embraced her tightly and begged Haley Duncan to arrive alive at the place where only he would be. Now the hero must return to the castle. From now on, some royal knights will protect Haley until the wedding ceremony so that nothing happens to her. And at the same time, they will make sure that the Duke does not raise his hand against the future queen. Roderick Peruse Blake is the ruler of the Kingdom of Cayenne. Carrying so much karma and resentment, he still managed to survive. So the protagonist couldn't help but wonder who he really was. 4 days flew by, and the long-awaited wedding day finally arrived. Many already thought something would happen again, because misfortunes always befell the brides. They say Duke Duncan is a truly terrifying person. These rumors are present in Haley's memories. The memories are incomplete and have many gaps, but it can be said with certainty that the king already tried to marry twice. He only had one condition. It had to be a weak, noble family that did not aspire to power. The first bride died in an accident, the second was poisoned, and the third barely succeeded. However, the protagonist knew that the third one also failed, because the real Haley drowned in the river. Roderick entered the room and asked the bride if she had sweet dreams, since it was her last night at home. But that house doesn't deserve to be missed. Haley replied confusedly that she had a good night. Today, surprisingly, nothing stuck to her fiancé. But the protagonist clearly remembered that he was full of evil spirits, so she didn't understand why. If you look closely, Roderick has quite a cute face. In a way, Haley even felt envious. The king noticed his fiancé's fixed gaze and frowned slightly. He asked with disgust what she was doing. The protagonist realized she was staring at him, so she quickly looked away. She apologized to her fiancé, saying she was very nervous. Roderick sighed tiredly and coldly said that he hated being lied to. The king was certain that the lady was not nervous at all. The protagonist covered her mouth with her hand, realizing she had made a mistake again, and her reaction seemed amusing to Roderick. The girl decided to be honest and admitted that she was just trying to be more cautious in front of a high-ranking person. If she didn't control herself, she might make a mistake. Haley began to get nervous for being too honest, but the king asked her to keep acting like she was now. He understood what she meant. A servant entered the room with a knock and, bowing, announced that it was time to leave. Roderick turned to the lady and told her it was time to go. Taking His Majesty's hand, Haley went with the king to the ceremonial hall. The body's ingrained habits were terrifying. The protagonist never wore high heels or such voluminous clothes, but she could walk so naturally. Suddenly, the girl felt a slight breeze. Horror gripped Haley's entire body as the terrible suspicion assailed her. Sensing another aura, the heroine raised her head up. Just above the priest's head was a spirit on a noble white horse. His face remained serious, expressing no emotion whatsoever. Haley could feel such a grand spirit for the first time. That's why she was now in a confusion of feelings. It doesn't look like a ghost or an evil spirit. However, despite that, it was on a higher level. Suddenly, the creature's gaze turned towards Haley. The girl immediately lowered her gaze, aware that if she got involved with him, trouble was assured. Suddenly, Roderick asked Haley Duncan, with bewilderment, what did that clowning mean? The protagonist apologized and clung tighter to her fiancé's arm. This world is a strange and terrifying place, and it is most likely infested with vengeful spirits. Therefore, Haley must act cautiously. In the middle of the night, the commander of the first squadron advised His Majesty to consider their offer. However, Roderick mockingly replied that even if it were Duncan, it wouldn't be easy. Now Jade, the commander of the first squadron, is saying outrageous things. Contrary to what Roderick had heard before, she doesn't seem that naive. Jade decided to find out if they were really the work of that person. The incidents in which His Majesty's 2 fiancés died are very suspicious. Therefore, the commander of the first squadron suspected that Haley Duncan's father eliminated all the rivals. Roderick's gaze turned cold and thoughtful when Jade asked him if the king believed Duke Duncan was guilty. If the previous 2 fiancés hadn't been murdered, there would have been no need to ally with a powerful family like the Duncans. The Duke openly declared his desire to ally with the royal family, and it is highly likely that he is the culprit. But Duncan's daughter tried to commit suicide. They didn't try to murder her, yet she had no intention of becoming queen. Although this fact doesn't eliminate suspicion about her father, so for now we must keep an eye on the Duncans. And thinking about how to use Haley to our advantage, Jade, confused, asked His Majesty if it wasn't time for him to leave already. It seems the captain of the first squadron feared the king would abandon his fiancée on their wedding night. But the king ordered more to be served. Jade begged His Majesty to show more compassion, since his wife was still a young woman caught in the game. Instead of answering, Roderick ordered someone to stay in the queen's rooms to watch over her. Jade accepted the order and asked His Majesty not to worry about it. Roderick drank all the alcohol in one gulp and slammed the glass down on the table. Immediately after, the man stood up and headed for the exit. The king seems fine today. The commander of the first squadron assumed that His Majesty's madness had probably subsided. The king suffers from a nervous breakdown and severe insomnia, and as the symptoms worsened, rumors spread. Jade prayed silently that her ruler would be well. Roderick walked with a firm step towards the room he needed, but the dark spirits managed to catch up to him. The king once again heard the creature's maniacal laughter, which did not cease for a moment. He was even surprised by how well he felt, but now he felt like his head was going to explode. The protagonist looked at her reflection in the mirror and wondered if her nightgown was too thin. Today is the wedding night. Nothing like this had ever happened to Kang E, because she always hid in her village. It's not that she wasn't up for it. It could even be considered a great opportunity, because the ghosts of virgins and the ghosts of bachelors were particularly resentful. The protagonist didn't understand why it was so important in their lives. Therefore, Haley decided that she would definitely try to find out. However, all the enthusiasm disappeared as soon as the girl saw her husband standing at the door of the room with his arms crossed. Roderick clutched his head, which wouldn't stop buzzing. Haley didn't understand why there were so many evil spirits around him, as if the man had been on a battlefield or in a cemetery. Suddenly, the king announced that she was now the queen. The Duke is very fussy when it comes to his son. Roderick sat on the edge of the bed, and the protagonist started frantically thinking about what she should do. She sat down too and felt uncomfortable. Haley decided to break the silence and asked the king if he was all right. They couldn't allow the man to succumb to the voices of the evil spirits constantly screaming in his ear. So the heroine began to shake her husband by the shoulders, begging him to come to his senses. Roderick lifted his head and looked at the girl with bewilderment. He had completely lost his mind. So Haley started shaking the man even harder, shouting at the top of her lungs that he wasn't like this at all. Roderick grimaced as if in pain, which meant that the protagonist's words were reaching him. However, the man lost consciousness and fell to his knees onto Haley. But the girl could see that he was much better. The physical form of that man is very good. The sharp nose, chin, and head shape are simply perfect. But watch out, even if Roderick is weak, his energy is amazing. Evil spirits shouldn't cling to someone like that. Why is this happening to the protagonist? His grandmother's words echoed in Haley's mind. If she starts noticing the spirits, they will notice her too. If you meddle in otherworldly affairs, that world will meddle in your life. So it's better not to even try, right? But he saved her from Duke Duncan, who was mistreating her. Haley only sees spirits and has some skills learned from her grandmother. If she associates with spirits, she will only lose out. But as a thank you, shouldn't she at least help him once? At least, may that person sleep soundly tonight. The evil spirits instantly understood that the girl saw them. The protagonist abruptly tore off a piece of cloth from her nightgown, enough for the ritual. She wasn't sure if it would work, but she bit her thumb until it bled anyway. After all, fighting ghosts is a battle of strength. So the girl drew symbols with blood on the torn piece of cloth, and then she ordered the dead to leave. Because the world of the living and the dead must never mix. Impure forces must return where they belong. After those words, the souls began to retreat. Panting, Haley concluded that she had succeeded, but instantly, she felt nausea rising in her throat and slight dizziness. Haley did not manage to purify them, she only expelled the dead briefly, but they will return. The protagonist decided to hide the amulet under the bed. But at least now, the king could sleep peacefully tonight. Haley could return the favor for his kindness. The young woman suddenly felt weak, so she snuggled up next to the man and fell asleep. The next day dawned. The protagonist slowly opened her eyes and immediately saw someone in front of her. She flinched when the king, in a suspiciously calm tone, asked if she was awake yet. Haley recoiled sharply at once. The girl, confused, asked the man why he was looking at her so strangely. He pointed at her torn nightgown. Haley immediately blushed and Roderick asked if it was her doing, as he didn't remember a passionate night. The girl immediately started waving her hand, trying to explain that nothing had happened between them. Of course, she wasn't complaining that nothing had happened between them. Roderick threw a blanket and asked the protagonist to cover herself. If it wasn't him, the man asked if there was anyone else in the room. Haley didn't know how to justify herself and replied that she had done it herself. Roderick didn't understand the reason, and the girl explained that she was very hot and felt stifled while sleeping. The king pretended not to have heard any of that. Then he got up to leave and allowed the girl a little more rest. The door slammed shut, and Haley was even more embarrassed that the king pretended not to hear anything. So it wasn't him, Roderick thought to himself. The memories of last night were broken, because the man thought he was on the verge of madness. However, his mind was clear now. Since Haley Duncan arrived at this castle, this has happened twice, but the girl kept making strange excuses. 4 days have passed since that moment. After that horrible first night, Haley didn't see the king again. It's not that she was going to thank him, but for some reason the girl was a little sad. But now is not the time to think about that. The protagonist decided to try to make a decent amulet, but she didn't have the necessary ingredients. After that night, the evil spirits began to torment her. They whispered incessantly that Roderick would cut off her head, and she would inevitably die painfully. However, the girl had already died once, so it would be cruel for it to happen a second time. She needs to raise a barrier, which means hiding piles of amulets behind paintings and under the furniture. Now Haley began to regret not listening to her grandmother and helping the king. Suddenly, the protagonist heard a soft cry. It didn't resemble an evil spirit, because the energy was completely different. Haley approached the curtain and drew it back. She immediately froze and looked down, surprised. On the floor sat a small, shining spirit with tears in its eyes. The girl, perplexed, asked the creature what it was doing there and why it wasn't going home. But the little one replied that its home was there. Haley understood that it wasn't an evil spirit, so she promised not to hurt it. The little one confessed that it was actually very scared. The protagonist began to worry that she was the one scaring the little one with her amulet. But then Haley directed her gaze to the cracked jewelry box. It seems this object is over 100 years old, and old objects often contain someone's memories. So it's the spirit of the jewelry box. Perhaps because the jewelry box is damaged, it cannot hide or use its powers completely. Haley apologized to the little one, as her clumsiness prevented her from fixing it. But instead, she promised not to allow dark forces to enter that room. It was all she could do. Thus, the little spirit wouldn't be afraid. The child accepted and begged her to put what she held in her hand back in its home. It started spinning around, repeating its request over and over like a small child. This cunning spirit must be 300 years old, not 100. The protagonist granted its wish, and now a radiant smile lit up the small spirit's face. At this, Haley also started to smile. It seems that, after arriving here, this is the first time she has felt happy and smiled. Another 4 days passed. The protagonist fell ill from the energy she invested in the amulets. She overdid it. Still, there is much to do to stabilize this place. There is no time to waste. Haley carved a piece of wood and made a bracelet, but this is not enough. We need more. The young woman must carve a pillar and place it in the room to increase protection against evil spirits. Roderick leaned over the girl and asked what she was doing. What does he want to know? Startled, the protagonist dropped the amulet. Oh no, what a disaster. The maid told the king that his wife was not well, so Roderick brought medicine to see her. Then the man pointed at Deborah, who was standing behind him. What a surprise. The protagonist didn't expect it, so she awkwardly thanked him for his concern. How awkward. The girl looked at the door and saw that the spirits couldn't enter. The barrier's effect works, but it couldn't stop the most horrific ones, so the pillar must be erected as soon as possible. Roderick decided to take a look at what his wife was fiddling with. It turned out to be a simple cylindrical stick of considerable dimensions. The king and the maid were suddenly petrified. Deborah suspected that nothing happened on the wedding night, but she didn't think it would come to this. Unexpectedly for Haley, the king confiscated her amulet, and also the knife she held in her hand. The queen, who just jumped into the water, has a knife, so Roderick couldn't let it go. Therefore, this thing is also confiscated. The protagonist couldn't believe it. She needs to create the exorcism pillar. Roderick headed for the exit, asking the girl to drink the medicine he brought. He went to check the report from the captain of the knights, because it seemed suspicious to him. Then, the man discovered a burning smell coming from the queen's room, and the soldiers found ashes. The girl managed to find a kitchen knife, and every day she is carving something. That was precisely what made Roderick uneasy. Moreover, he didn't understand what the hell was going on. The protagonist collapsed, exhausted on her bed. She is terribly frustrated, because she could have finished the pillar in a couple of days. And now everything was in vain. In the end, Haley has nothing to do now. So, the protagonist took out the book she hid a few days ago from under the pillow. Now we can read this. Haley Duncan's diary, which the protagonist brought from the duchy. October 17th is the real Haley's birthday. The little spirit asked her how she could see him. If many priests visited this room and no one saw him. Although there are good priests who do see, surely those were fakes. They just pretend to be benefactors to get your money. And if you let your guard down, they will rob you right in your face. Although the little one reminded her that she has no face, the protagonist took this diary on purpose. In the hope of recovering lost memories, Haley lived without worrying too much about anything. Suddenly, the maid Deborah knocked on the room door. The protagonist put the diary aside and allowed the woman to enter her room. Deborah brought a letter from the queen's maternal home. There was also medicine, but the protagonist refused to take it because she wasn't sick anymore. But Haley did accept the letter. In it, the Duke expressed concern for his daughter's condition and said he sent the medicine along with the letter on purpose. However, the girl knew it was all a lie. As a father, the Duke wanted to ask his daughter only one thing. This intrigued Haley. The protagonist urgently needs to see His Majesty, and thanks to Deborah, she learned that the king is in the reception hall. The maid also reported that she would immediately call the servants to dress the queen at that very moment. Haley didn't know how to reply to the Duke. The owner of this body, who was supposed to be queen, felt almost nothing. When the soul leaves, feelings leave too, and only resentment or ideals prevent it. Then they become vengeful or protective spirits, tied to this world. The Duke knew that many served the king, but he wanted people from his estate. At that precise moment, in the reception hall, they were hotly debating the looting of the royal treasury. Roderick was forced to listen to all of it. The officials shuddered upon hearing a loud bang, looking at the king. Roderick coldly asked if they were finished yet. Perhaps there are still some in this room who haven't spoken. Jade knew that the king was very dangerous like this, and that if it got worse, he would have to be stopped. 3 years have passed since his ascension to the throne, and his dark side has intensified. It's as if he has become a completely different person. 2 people witnessed the horror by accident. At the worst possible moment, Deborah suggested to the queen that she return to her chambers, and Haley agreed. The protagonist decided not to get involved, but the evil spirits swirled over the king, and they laughed out loud, demanding to kill everyone in that room. This worried Haley a lot. Suddenly, the king gripped his sword tightly and began to draw it from its scabbard. The protagonist shuddered at the sight and froze. The commander of the first squadron of knights jumped up, wanting to prevent the king from making a fatal mistake. However, Haley was faster. The evil spirits kept whispering their desires to the king. The protagonist ran towards His Majesty and grabbed his hand tightly, the hand holding the unsheathed sword. In reality, Haley had gotten there without realizing it. She began to blame Deborah, who should have held her tighter. Roderick's gaze cleared as soon as he heard Haley Duncan's voice, begging him to listen to her. The protagonist also realized the light had returned to the man's eyes. Only then did she understand that the beads had caused that effect. That's why the evil spirits retreated a little. The king looked at the young woman in astonishment and whispered her name. He didn't understand what had happened, or why Haley Duncan was holding his hand. The man looked at the officials, who were now sitting silently, afraid to make any sound. Roderick carefully withdrew his hand from Haley Duncan's grip, and then sheathed his sword. The protagonist shuddered when the king abruptly turned back and looked directly at her. He asked only one question: why? Haley was bewildered, since it was because of His Majesty that all this chaos began. Now he looked at her, with an expression that told her not to make him repeat it twice. Haley actually came to talk about a letter sent by Duke Duncan. Since she has a bad relationship with the Duke, this will cause negative emotions in the king, and then the spirits will be unleashed. Therefore, Haley lied and said she only came to offer a cup of tea, but it seems she did it at the wrong time, so she immediately apologized for her rudeness. Roderick looked at the girl suspiciously, and she explained that she just wanted to thank him for the medicine sent. The officials are very nervous throughout this time. The main protagonist began to beg Deborah mentally to help her. The maid quickly understood everything and explained to His Majesty that the queen loved the exquisite Racharak tea. In the end, Roderick ordered tea to be brought to them, and Haley mentally called Deborah the best of all. The king announced that the meeting was over for today. Meanwhile, our heroes went for tea. The protagonist took a small sip and immediately felt an unpleasant taste, but she tried to play it cool. Meanwhile, the king watched her intently. Haley felt immediate discomfort. The young woman was surprised when His Majesty suddenly asked her what she was thinking about, but what interested him most was why she did it, and why she kept drinking such bad tea. This man was able to decipher Haley quickly. The protagonist wiped the tea residue from her lips and replied to His Majesty that he couldn't judge her tastes. She was saying the same thing again. Haley convinced herself once more that the king wasn't a severe person and didn't mind joking. The problem is that he has evil spirits clinging to him. As soon as the man moves away from her, those horrible undead start harassing him. This kind of thing really made Haley nervous. In any case, it's unpleasant to watch. So the protagonist approached the king and asked if he had been sleeping well lately. Roderick answered with a question. Was it that obvious that he hadn't slept well? It was very obvious. The protagonist gathered her courage and then sat next to His Majesty. She gently touched his hand with hers and began to massage the king's palms. The knights behind were astonished by their queen's action, who was not afraid of His Majesty's anger. Surprise appeared on Roderick's face. This got out of hand. Everyone in the palace knows that the couple's relationship is quite cold. Jade hoped that His Majesty's mood would not worsen. Instead, Roderick smiled and asked what she was doing, and she replied that this made one sleep faster. Haley confessed that she had also suffered from insomnia sometimes. The smile didn't leave Roderick's face, because now this girl wasn't even trying to hide her lies. Now Haley was convinced. The evil spirits tormented the king for so long that his energy is now entangled and blocked. A person with his energy is even more dangerous in that state. But Roderick still didn't understand what she was doing. Haley knew better than anyone how energy flows in the human body. Before the grandmother's exorcism, the heroine had to keep the man's energy under control. She asked the king if it hurt, and he answered with a firm no. Now, Haley started massaging the man's back. Roderick relaxed and thanked the girl for her concern. People with great energy would hesitate to mess with vengeful spirits. So Haley wondered, how many misdeeds had he committed for them to harass him like this? The heroine pressed a point, and Roderick immediately felt something strange. Haley had almost found the flow. The man didn't understand what was happening to him. Then he felt a growing warmth inside him, and his eyes began to slowly close. And then his body relaxed, and Roderick rested his head on the protagonist's lap, plunged into a deep sleep. Now the energy flow has improved a bit. It will be easier for His Majesty to withstand the attack of the evil spirits for a while. But the protagonist still apologized mentally to the man, as it was the only thing she could do. Suddenly, the commander of the first squadron asked, astonished, if he was really sleeping. Haley explained that when one is tired and receives a massage, tension decreases. And the king was probably very exhausted. Jader replied confusedly that His Majesty hadn't slept for several days. Furthermore, the king has been suffering from insomnia lately. Now the commander of the first squadron of knights tries to explain the situation that happened before. Haley replied that sometimes people become very sensitive. Don't make a big deal out of it, she simply had no other choice. The butler brought a blanket and carefully tucked in His Majesty. From Deborah's disapproving look, the man knew he should bring another blanket for His Majesty. But Haley replied that it wasn't necessary, because they were done with the tea and could leave now. After those words, Roderick clung even tighter to the girl. Haley instantly understood that those people behind her were thinking something strange. Of course, something stirred inside the protagonist. This man, King Roderick, simply moves instinctively looking for pure energy, either because of the amulets the protagonist has or due to virtuous energy. As he has been suffering from dark and impure force for a long time, he tries to find a quiet place. In the end, Haley begged for a blanket for herself too. Deborah snatched it from the butler at once. Haley was also exhausted, and it's not the same as when she invests her energy in creating amulets. Definitely, being with this man is tiring. But for some reason, Haley felt warmth. Roderick blinked in bewilderment upon waking up and realizing the situation. However, he decided to clarify it with Jade. The commander of the first squadron reminded His Majesty that after having tea with the queen, she sat next to him, but afterwards, the king immediately fell asleep. Jade decided not to tell how the newlyweds gave each other massages before sleeping. She simply couldn't do it. Roderick directed his gaze to the sleeping girl. He decided that the queen should be accommodated in a comfortable place, and his bedroom was the best option. Jade was slack-jawed upon hearing that. Meanwhile, the king explained that it was so as not to wake the queen, as her room was far away. The butler and the maid began to doubt that nothing had happened between the king and the queen on their wedding night. However, Jade immediately exclaimed that they must carry out His Majesty's order quickly. Deborah replied that she would immediately go to prepare the room. Roderick's physical condition suddenly improved again. He looked at Haley Duncan and wondered who the hell she was. A moment later, the protagonist woke up and immediately assumed that somehow she had reached hell. Perhaps she just died in her sleep, or maybe she reincarnated again. But the pink hair and pale hands say otherwise. The protagonist is still in Haley's body, so she hasn't died. From the atmosphere and the cloud of evil spirits, she deduces that it is the king's room. She wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The maid Deborah entered upon hearing that His Majesty had woken up from a long sleep. The protagonist begged the woman to take her back to her room. In the end, Haley escaped the haunted house and learned that the king sent her to her room. The girl found it funny and laughed, as it was obvious the king was trying to repay her in some way. And right now, Haley realizes she forgot to talk about the letter. In her diary, the lady wrote that her father wants to marry her to the king, but she loves Lawrence with all her soul. However, all the entries are short and their context strange. The protagonist wanted to know more about the real Haley. Taking her father's letter, the girl thought, how would Haley act in my place? If we think about it, the king proposed having dinner together today, and Haley was surprised by such a sudden proposal. The protagonist approached the window and realized she doesn't want to die. The girl didn't understand why the real, stupid Haley jumped into the water. Obviously, predestined fate cannot be avoided. Even if a small annoyance is avoided, the thread cannot be changed. Like the deceased Haley, whose fate was to die. People often say they like their destiny, but those who cannot foresee the destiny that awaits them say so. The protagonist never loved the destiny she was given. If we analyze it closely, this is the first meal between the king and Haley. However, Roderick did not invite the girl for a pleasant time. A few days ago, the commander of the first squadron of knights reported a letter Duke Duncan sent to the queen. Jade brought a copy for the king to read carefully. The letter talks about infiltrating the palace with the duke's people, and the sender is aware of the queen's illness. It is evident that Duke Duncan seeks to place his people in the palace. He knows that Roderick will not allow it, so he tries to provoke a banal power struggle through these means. The king must root this out immediately. Precisely for this reason, they wanted to place an insignificant noble in the queen's place. Roderick proposed taking advantage of this opportunity to discover the real Haley Duncan. But now the king didn't know how to start the conversation. These thoughts tormented Roderick relentlessly. Jade perfectly understood that His Majesty was not feeling well today either. The butler announced the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen, and Roderick immediately raised his head. His gaze lit up instantly. He raised his head and looked towards where His Majesty's footsteps were coming from. The man immediately got up and felt that the air around him had suddenly purified. This happened right at the moment Haley entered. He observed the thoughtful face of the young woman and felt that with every step she took, a cool breeze blew. It was as if another world converged around her. Surprisingly, the headache had disappeared. The protagonist looked at His Majesty with bewilderment upon seeing him sigh deeply. With a smile on his face, he announced that this was, in fact, very strange. Haley understood nothing, and the king, with a mocking smile, indicated that she could come in and sit down. The protagonist obeyed his will. Roderick once again directed an attentive gaze at the young woman, gathering his courage. Haley informed His Majesty that she wanted to tell him something, and the king allowed it. The protagonist revealed that a few days ago, she had received a letter from her father from the duchy. Jade, from King's Pietras, did not expect the young woman to bring up that topic. Roderick smiled, thinking that this girl had stolen his turn, as he had completely forgotten his initial objective. She talked about the content of the letter, which she had brought just in case, for His Majesty to see. The king leaned back in his chair and replied that he didn't need it, asking her what she intended to do. Haley was surprised that this time, the king gave her the right to choose. She remembered the moment when he himself allowed her to die only after she wore the crown, or else he himself would take her life. The king burst out laughing at the girl's words. At that precise moment, Jade did not understand at all why His Majesty was yielding to the opponent's words. Haley frowned and asked with disgust if this time the right to choose was fair. Roderick laughed again and replied that when she expressed herself with such honesty, she looked very inappropriate. He paused to think, how long has it been since he laughed like that? This girl was definitely amusing. So Roderick let her continue. Seeing the situation, the protagonist could deduce that everything was fine. She didn't know what Haley wanted to do, so first she decided to give her opinion. The girl doesn't want the king's or the duke's influence, nor does she want to take the real Haley's life lightly. So the protagonist replied that she would write to her father, rejecting the proposal. Those words surprised His Majesty. Not much time has passed since Haley arrived at the palace, so from others' point of view, it would be unfair. Jade was glad that now they didn't have to get into that meaningless argument with the Duncans. However, Roderick thought it was too soon to relax, because at first glance it might seem like a satisfactory answer. But surprisingly, the Queen explained her refusal with a reason, not blaming him for everything. Although Haley refused, it would be wrong to completely reject the Duke, as anything could happen in the future. If she adds the word, for now, she will leave the possibility of future negotiations open. Roderick knew it. His wife was just pretending to be innocent, but she had planned everything she needed. It could be said that true blood runs in her veins, like that of a real fox. The young woman named Haley Duncan is quite interesting, although still, she unsettled Roderick a bit. The butler served the food, and the young woman asked His Majesty if she could eat. Since the conversation was over, Roderick allowed the protagonist not to wait for him from now on. The more he got to know this girl, the more interesting she became to him. But with all this, things were starting to get a little dangerous. Even if it was small, Roderick was starting to feel attracted to Duke Duncan's daughter. Perhaps it was precisely because the madness was intensifying. Taking a glass, the king remembered an important detail. This week he will be away from home, so he will be outside the castle. The protagonist was stunned by such news. According to the first of the 5 commandments of God, one must not take a life, because that accumulates karma. Roderick, the ruling beast Peruse Blake, had a nickname derived from his second name, Raging Beast. The nickname arose because of his madness. As aware of his uncontrollable impulses, Roderick tried to relieve them by hunting. But without knowing it, he was sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss of madness. The more blood the man sees, the more the torment of the vengeful spirits accumulates. The protagonist looked at the king, who at that moment was asking the knights if they had checked the provisions. Haley wanted to tell His Majesty that taking a life was not good, but she knew they would mock it. At that moment, Roderick turned his head and looked at the young woman. Immediately after, he decided to approach her. In an indifferent tone, the man asked if she wanted to tell him something before he left. Haley realized that outside the castle, the evil spirits clung less, and she asked what he meant. Roderick offered to ask her to capture someone, but the protagonist rejected such a proposition. Then, the man suggested wishing her a safe journey, and Haley did. But in reality, she just wished the king wouldn't go anywhere. Suddenly, he pointed to the side and asked the protagonist if she wasn't going to act like them. Haley looked at the knight and the maid accompanying him. Suddenly, the man abruptly pulled her towards him and kissed her. The protagonist immediately turned red. Very red. Haley couldn't believe that the king really expected her to do something like that with him. Seeing the girl's reaction, Roderick burst into loud laughter again. With a smile on his face, he told the young woman that he was just joking. At this statement, Haley tensed up even more, until the king told her she was slack-jawed. The protagonist puffed out her cheeks and turned away, while the king said it had been fun. In a somewhat offended tone, Haley asked His Majesty to return safely, and above all, without injuries. Roderick smiled and replied that he would do so. That attitude was driving the protagonist crazy. Suddenly, the man abruptly approached Haley Duncan and whispered in her ear to stay away from the water. He moved away a little and, for a fraction of a second, lingered looking into her eyes, while his lips were dangerously close. Then, the man straightened up and asked her if she had understood. He probably just fears she will jump into the water like Haley. In other words, he didn't want her to die. And the protagonist's ears instantly turned red, and they also started itching a lot. With a smile on his face, Roderick announced that he had to leave, and then he left in the direction of his knights. Watching him leave, the protagonist was left wondering if everything would be all right. Some time later, the head of the first squadron begged His Majesty not to chase the boar, since the night forest was dangerous, but Roderick ignored the advice and even so took the beast's life. His eyes were dark and every sound had faded. The man knew very well that he shouldn't act like that for the kingdom and his subjects. If she were by his side at that moment, everything would be different. But now, the evil spirits whispered to Roderick to kill as many animals as possible. Jade stopped the horse as soon as they managed to reach the king. The knights couldn't believe that someone in this world was capable of tearing apart an already dead animal like that. Now Roderick seemed to have transformed into another person, as if there was no hope left. As soon as he heard the rustle of leaves, horror appeared on Hate's face. Right in front of His Majesty, a huge bear stood. The commander of the first squadron immediately ordered them to shoot, asking the king to step aside. But Roderick didn't hear him at all. In an instant, complete darkness invaded the man's eyes. It was pitch black, but the protagonist couldn't sleep for some reason. If this man keeps killing, his condition will worsen, and that worried the protagonist a lot. Although, on the other hand, Haley didn't understand why she cared so much. Finally, the young woman decided to go out for a walk. The moon shone brightly, and Haley soon went out into the garden of the huge castle. Nearby, the young woman saw a lake, but she wasn't going to approach it because of Grandma Johnson's words. Perhaps because she had been told her whole life not to go near the water, the protagonist started watching from afar. Haley decided to sit on the steps. Suddenly, a sudden gust of wind lashed her. The protagonist's eyes opened upon feeling a familiar energy nearby. That spirit she saw at the wedding is now by her side. For some reason, he got off the horse, and then the spirit simply sat down next to her. Not even the god Grandma Johnson worshipped was like this, so Haley must not contact him under any circumstances. However, a smile immediately appeared on her face. The spirit asked if she could see him. The protagonist, as if nothing was happening, mentally asked the being not to speak to her. Haley thought the best solution was simply to leave there. She was about to get up when the spirit whispered that she was not the real Haley Duncan. The protagonist almost reacted, but in the end managed to contain her emotions. The spirit told the young woman that Roderick was coming here because he was injured. Haley kept ignoring, and the spirit added that it must surely be a very serious injury. But His Majesty doesn't even have an heir, so it's unknown what will happen if the king suddenly dies. Haley stood up suddenly, scared by the spirit's words. The man burst out laughing, and concluded with a smile that in the end she was listening to him. The protagonist, indignant, asked if he dared to joke about a person's life. They always did the same thing. Seriously, Haley didn't understand why they acted like that towards normal people. The spirit smilingly told her not to be angry, that Roderick had really suffered. Maybe it was just a vile lie. But Haley couldn't do absolutely anything. The spirit suggested she hurry. She might meet him if she ran now. And then, the creature simply vanished. Haley had to go to the castle now. Where was that man? The commander of the first squadron of knights told His Majesty that the castle was already visible. To hold on a little longer. Roderick only saw darkness and prayed in his mind for anyone, to help him. The protagonist ran at full speed until she smelled blood, a sign that His Majesty had returned. The knights ordered the butler to wake the doctor immediately. Haley didn't understand how such a mass of evil spirits had clung to the king. The knights sent the king to the bedroom, not suspecting that they shouldn't have done so. The protagonist frantically thought about what she should do. Doubts tormented her, but finally the girl made a decision. Suddenly, she threw open the door to her room, thus waking up a small sleeping spirit. Immediately after, Haley ran to the table and took out several amulets. The little spirit asked in surprise what she was doing. Seeing that the girl wanted to take something strange from under the bed, it started begging her not to do it. Haley headed for the exit, promising that as soon as she returned, she would fix everything. The little spirit started crying, because it had just woken up and there were already so many problems. If the body and mind weaken, the evil spirits will become stronger and insistent. Furthermore, His Majesty's life is in danger. Haley hoped this would be enough. Rushing to the king's room, the girl discovered that he was still destroying an already dead prey. And he didn't let go of the blood-soaked sword. The protagonist immediately pushed aside all the servants, demanding to be let through. One of the knights strongly advised His Majesty not to enter the king's chambers for the time being. Deborah ran towards Haley and begged her to immediately return to her bedroom. The protagonist remembered that she was the queen and therefore could enter any corner of this castle. Behind the maid, the doctor appeared, who ordered everyone to move away immediately. Haley entered the room along with him. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the young woman froze, shocked by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. It was plagued with monsters who couldn't stop laughing out loud and demanded that Roderick kill someone immediately. From fear, Haley even covered her mouth. The commander of the first squadron of knights looked at His Majesty, astonished, not understanding why he had come. He extended a handkerchief and offered the queen to cover herself with it, because there was a strong smell of blood in the room. But Haley refused, because it wasn't the smell of blood, but the enormous amount of negative energy. Only now did the young woman notice the wound from a beast's claws on the man's body. He is not seriously injured. His life is not in danger. In other words, that cheeky spirit simply tricked her. The doctor was stunned when His Majesty fell to his knees. The protagonist started blaming herself for falling for the ghost's words again. She became alert upon hearing His Majesty muttering something very low, still conscious. Only then did Haley understand that he was saying, "Kill." The king was repeating exactly what the evil spirits incessantly told him. Roderick's eyes were open, but he stared blankly, not reacting to anyone in the room. The queen and the doctor tensed up when they saw His Majesty raise the sword. If a soul wound can be called an injury, this man receives mortal wounds daily. But he has no one to tell the cause to, and no one can heal him, as Roderick is alone. The protagonist grabbed the king's hand. The knight tried to stop the queen immediately. This is very dangerous. Roderick looked at the protagonist as soon as she worriedly asked how he was. He just opened his eyes, but didn't regain consciousness. The evil spirits were too strong and wouldn't give up so easily. Therefore, Haley must start the battle first. Adhere strictly to the law, because evil cannot defeat what is right. The spirits instantly shouted that they wouldn't leave her in peace if the girl kept interfering. Initially, Haley wasn't going to get involved in ghost matters. But now the complete opposite was happening. There is no one else in this world who can help the man. Only her. Therefore, the protagonist was not going to back down. So she demanded that the impure forces disappear immediately. She must achieve it, one way or another. Roderick was sunk in the deepest darkness. He saw absolutely nothing, nor did he hear anything. In the end, the hero, like a truly mad king, cannot escape this darkness. But suddenly, Roderick glimpsed a light. He raised his head and looked towards the sky. Someone called him, and Roderick reached out towards the source of the sound, still wondering who it could be. The man did not understand whose beautiful voice that was. Upon regaining consciousness, Roderick let out a dull moan. Haley anxiously asked the king if he was all right and if he could hear her voice. Roderick looked at the girl with surprise as she asked him another question. If he could see her. As soon as the evil spirits vanished, the king's sword clattered to the floor. The protagonist, in a sweet tone, assured that everything was fine now. The healer immediately cleared his throat and said it was not a serious wound. So the king was fine. Haley used too much energy and instantly felt horrible nausea rising in her throat. In a hoarse voice, Roderick asked the girl why she was there. But the protagonist didn't know the exact answer to that question either, and supposed she had simply been scared at that moment. The king could have been grateful that she came, but Haley decided not to say anything about it now. Now that the man had regained consciousness, the girl could return to her room. However, Roderick roughly grabbed her hand. With a hint of sadness and hope, he begged Haley to stay just a little longer. In an instant, the king became very tender. And since His Majesty arrived, everything feels like a dream. The heroine's heart started beating fast, and she pulled her hand away, reminding the king that he shouldn't exert himself like that. Sadness was reflected on Roderick's face. The protagonist knew this would happen. She started hitting the king with her hands, demanding that he never go hunting again. Haley stopped dead in her tracks, just as the king asked her why. Her whole body was trembling, but Roderick still smiled and asked why he shouldn't go. With tears in her eyes, Haley replied that she loves animals very much. Deborah and Jade concluded that His Majesty has gone completely crazy. Roderick raised his hand and congratulated everyone on the good job. Then he asked everyone to leave except the queen. The protagonist felt the shame too late. She cursed at herself for her action and wondered why she was acting so strangely. Roderick watched the trembling girl intently. The protagonist looked at him, surprised when he told her that he had seen light in the darkness. And then he extended his hand. Haley took it just like now. In other words, the king dreamed that the protagonist chased away the evil spirits. Roderick supposed that the girl had seen horrible things upon arrival, but he didn't want to talk much. In reality, there is nothing that can be done about it. It might sound irresponsible and useless, but Roderick confessed to Haley Duncan that he couldn't do anything. So this guy knows what's happening to her and how seriously bad it is. And yet, his eyes were still bright. Are those really the eyes of someone with so much accumulated bad karma? Haley couldn't feign ignorance while this man was falling apart alone. The king asked if she was angry about the trouble, but she said she couldn't be. Roderick replied that she is Duncan and also the queen. If she isn't angry, could she talk with him a little more? For some reason, the girl's voice calmed him. It's because of the heroine's energy and things like rosaries and amulets, not because of the voice. But Haley still agreed to stay and started telling His Majesty something. 2 days later, in the royal castle, the queen fell ill again, so Duke Duncan was demanding to send known servants to take care of her. Again, this man with the same old tune. In reality, Haley was working hard on restoring the bedroom barrier, and she ended up exhausted. Meanwhile, Duke Duncan exclaimed that his daughter couldn't make such requests. Roderick remembered that Haley was not only a daughter, but now Queen of Cayenne, so she should be treated accordingly. The Duke apologized for his rudeness and explained that he simply got very upset by the news about his beloved daughter. The king burst out laughing at those words. He perfectly remembered how that father hit his beloved daughter in the face. However, if Roderick said something like that there, the queen's authority could be compromised. Normally, the man wouldn't care and would simply kill him, but now he felt a strange restlessness. The Duke announced that, in that case, he would see the queen himself and ask for permission. Haley's father had an expression as if his daughter would submit to his will out of weakness. But Roderick didn't understand why people took her for that kind of person. He smiled slyly and asked if perhaps someone was forbidding meeting the queen. Jade shuddered and looked at the king in bewilderment. Roderick allowed the Duke to see his daughter because he knew she was not what he thought. The captain of the first squadron didn't understand how the king could allow the Duke to meet the queen. Instead of answering, Roderick asked Jade if he was doing his job well. Initially, when investigating the lady, he reported that Haley Duncan was called a lovely fool. However, all that turned out to be a complete sham. Roderick approached the queen's room and asked about her condition. The little spirit tensed instantly, because that King Roderick brought horrible beings again. The man entered and asked the girl not to get up. He immediately felt that, surprisingly, he felt very light. The protagonist was proud of herself, because this time, she managed to create an incredible barrier. Not much time passed when Haley got better, and then she fell ill again. As if it were revenge, because the king went away from home. Roderick told the queen that her father still demands that people be sent to the palace. Imagining the Duke's expression, Haley burst out laughing. With a smile on his face, Roderick told her that if she kept laughing like that, she would become a little rascal. Haley immediately covered her mouth with her hand. The man carefully studied the girl's pale face. Unexpectedly, the king asked the protagonist if he should assign her people from the Duncan family. Jade was extremely indignant about his king's behavior. Haley reminded His Majesty that he was giving her an option again. She was curious why he did it, and Roderick replied thoughtfully that he didn't know the right answer. The man decided to himself that he simply wanted to test her reaction again. The illusion of having the possibility to make choices is a very pleasant thing. But the protagonist replied that she would write a letter of rejection once more, this time with more precise wording. At that moment, Roderick didn't understand the girl's intentions at all. Suddenly, he was slack-jawed upon seeing a wooden statuette next to Haley's bed. Everyone present froze, and the king asked what she wanted that device for. Jade turned bright red, and Deborah whispered to the butler that nothing happened on the sovereign's first night. In an innocent voice, Haley explained that it was just her hobby. She also showed the king her bracelet and asked him to return the knife to finish her creation. Roderick said with disgust that everyone usually likes big things, but the protagonist replied confusedly, "That being big doesn't mean being strong." The man replied in a tense tone that this was also true, although his was quite large. Even though Roderick didn't know what it was, he ordered that thing to be hidden. A blushing maid informed His Majesty that it was time to take his medicine. Roderick again came to the conclusion that this girl was very strange. Disgust and even slight anger were visible on his face while she drank that horrible medicine. The man's eyes began to close slowly. Haley directed a look of astonishment at the man. It turned out that His Majesty had fallen asleep. The butler asked, almost without thinking, what to do with this strong insomnia, since even sleeping pills didn't help the king. And now Roderick was relaxing just by having the queen near. Jade wondered if the circulating rumors were true. About the Duncan family hiding a mysterious power in their blood, Haley tugged the king's leg. Waking him up, she told him it wasn't right to sleep like that. Roderick's eyes widened, surprised. He didn't expect to fall asleep. A second ago, the hero was rambling, and suddenly bam. He fell asleep in front of everyone. For some reason, he feels like he's going to have an epic nap. The protagonist tensed up when His Majesty announced he would approach her. And he leaned over. He put one foot on the bed and begged to be allowed to lie down next to her. Deborah instantly threw those tactless men out of the room. The maid wished them well and left, leaving Haley alone with the king. She wanted to send him to his room, but this looked more like a haunted house. Roderick swore he wouldn't do anything. He just wanted to sleep like a normal person. The protagonist tried to offer him her pillow, but the king refused. The girl's cheeks turned red like two lanterns. She leaned back and angrily reminded the king that he himself decided to support her sincere love. But now he's going to bed. Roderick laughed and called her cute, as he didn't think she would say something like that to her husband. She apologized and admitted that, for some reason, she decided to take a risk. In reality, Haley was very tired, so she was sure she could fall asleep very quickly. Unexpectedly, the king decided to apologize for the first night. The protagonist was startled to see the man's very attentive gaze. She wondered since when this had been happening, but what he had just said sounded very much like an apology. Roderick concluded that the pajamas didn't break on purpose that time, although he couldn't believe it. If he became aggressive again, the king asked the protagonist not to tolerate it, but to call Jade, or the others. Roderick is referring to the pajamas that Haley tore to use as an amulet. The protagonist repeated that he hadn't done it at that moment. It seems the king was still worried about that. Roderick let out a deep laugh and suggested they sleep, but Haley knew he didn't believe her, although she couldn't reveal the truth. The experience of being controlled by evil spirits and harming others was traumatic. The girl still didn't understand why she kept getting involved, having so many problems. Such a big and strong man hasn't broken down yet. Our heroes fell asleep, and the servants did everything in the castle. Upon waking up, the protagonist felt like she couldn't breathe and was suffocating. She barely opened her eyes, trying to understand what the hell was going on. It turns out that all this time, Haley was sleeping, trapped in His Majesty's arms. A silent scream of horror escaped the girl, vowing never to trust a man again. To this guy, the protagonist is nothing more than a pillow and a sleeping pill. Haley instantly turned red as a tomato. The girl tried to think that he was a sick and very lonely man, so as not to take it to heart. The protagonist even started considering the idea of counting sheep. But the man approached, and something strange brushed against the girl's body, making her panic. Haley kept counting sheep, but in her mind they were already kissing each other. The heroine must escape her fate as a virgin ghost now and enjoy the afterlife. Suddenly, the king pulled her towards him, even closer. Haley didn't understand at all why he kept touching her. She tried to move His Majesty away, even a little, to stop feeling so uncomfortable. But the man kept sleeping. Unexpectedly, he abruptly raised his arm, and his face came close to the girl's neck, which paralyzed her, because now she felt the king's hot and constant breath. Her heart began to beat even faster. Suddenly, Haley felt the king's lips on her neck. She tried to inhale air greedily, but found it difficult to do so. In the end, the protagonist started hitting the man on the back with her fists, demanding that he get off her immediately. Because of this, Roderick finally woke up. The girl under him, in a confused tone, said that this pose was very strange. Roderick immediately moved away, super fast. The protagonist could finally breathe, while her heart beat wildly. The man couldn't believe that, again, he acted like this in this situation. Haley panicked as soon as the king suddenly lifted the blanket. He sighed with relief, because the girl's clothes weren't torn, so he didn't do anything wrong. Roderick apologized instantly, touched her shoulder, and asked for forgiveness again. In a soft voice, the man asked if she had been very scared. The protagonist turned to the king, and now he could see her offended and pouting face. He immediately got up and asked the girl to rest, but he couldn't just leave like that, so he begged Haley to answer his question. But the girl remained silent, and then the man asked if she had decided not to talk to him. It was a bit childish, but the problem wasn't actually that Haley was scared, but that she was simply very surprised. It was so hot, and her heart beat fast, plus tingling wherever the king touched her. And now, when he was so affectionate, the girl wanted to behave like a child, because she had never had anything like this. Roderick apologized again and gently stroked the girl's head. The man left, and the protagonist's heart was still beating wildly. She didn't understand what that feeling was, but she knew she wouldn't sleep again. The king kept tapping his foot on the floor. He was a bundle of nerves. It had been more than 10 days since His Majesty had visited the Queen's chambers. The butler, Jimmy, was dying of curiosity. What had happened? But the commander had no idea. Now Roderick restrains himself from going there, because the Queen might feel uncomfortable. But the man thought, didn't she go too far with that face at that moment? They were still a couple, and Roderick had a doubt, what's going to happen now? Although this marriage was not by the Queen's will, which darkened Roderick even more. Butler Jimmy placed a jewelry box in front of the king, and explained that it was an offering from the Diamond region. Roderick asked Jade if he had seen the Queen's bracelet, and he confirmed his words. According to the king, this jewel is horrible, as if the past surpassed fashion. The image of his wife appeared in the man's mind, who told him that she made the bracelet herself. A slight smile appeared on Roderick's face, and he called Haley a strange girl again. Jade concluded that the king is simply grumpy towards the opponent he is interested in. The captain of the first squadron concluded that something happened between the queen and the king. The protagonist embarked on the search for the royal genealogy. The librarian replied that only royalty could see that, so he would bring other records. Haley reminded him that she was His Majesty's wife, and therefore also a member of royalty. The man immediately explained that it was a copy of written documents, and that he had something better for His Majesty. The librarian fell to his knees, thinking he had committed a mortal sin. The protagonist finally decided to take a look at that book, and promised she would treat it carefully. As soon as Haley returned to her room, she immediately asked the spirit to read the content to her. But the little one didn't want to do it, and begged the girl to take the book so she could read it herself. He pointed to Haley's diary, and told her that she hadn't even read that. Since living there, relying on Haley's incomplete memories, was insufficient, the heroine decided to read her diary. But it wasn't that simple, because the real Haley described, literally, the most absurd details of her life. In the end, the little one agreed to read the book. The first King Arthur conquered the Daimon Empire with a holy sword, an empire that ruled the continent with an evil spell, and created a kingdom. And the fourth king, to celebrate 100 years for national unity, strengthened relations with Melon, Rosal, and Duncan. Now the protagonist discovered that, initially, the Duncans were another nation. Haley had been recording every word the whole time. She was stunned when the spirit only read about King Roderick's birth and ascension to the throne. But at least the girl found out that her husband is 29 years old, 4 years younger than her previous age, and 8 years younger than the real Haley, which is a lot. That's probably why the king sometimes treats her like a child. And the protagonist also discovered that the misfortunes of the kingdom of Cayenne and King Roderick coincide this year. Furthermore, during this period, Queen Haley dies and the soul of a person from another world settles here. Unexpectedly, the spirit noticed that lately King Roderick hasn't been coming around here. She was happy because those horrible things don't follow him. In reality, the protagonist was doing her best not to think about it. She made him quite uncomfortable that day, so he surely doesn't want to see her even in a painting. In reality, the protagonist no longer cares if people turn their backs on her. As soon as the queen went out to the hallway, Deborah approached her, saying she could have ordered the book to be returned. Haley replied that it was fine, and immediately heard a familiar voice. In the training arena, King Roderick was sparring with the commander of the first squadron of knights. The girl hadn't seen him in so long. The protagonist's heart, for some strange reason, began to beat fast again. The maid said that His Majesty and Sir Jade had the same teacher, and they used to train together. But it had been a long time since Deborah witnessed something like that. Now Roderick looked like an elegant beast. Suddenly, the protagonist felt that with every breath, His Majesty's energy was purified. Surely, interacting with close friends is gradually calming him down. The girl mentally advised him to do this more often, instead of hunting. Haley looked sadly at the king and suggested to Deborah that they move on, since he clearly didn't want to see her. Roderick stopped and wiped the sweat drops that appeared on him. Then he turned abruptly. In a fraction of a second, the man reached the protagonist and grabbed her arm. It was amazing because just a second ago, His Majesty was so far away. Panting, Roderick asked Haley Duncan why she was simply leaving. The protagonist replied confusedly that she was just heading to her room. Roderick, annoyed, asked why she was talking like that again and asked her to speak as before. All this time, she thought he was avoiding her. That's why she wanted to maintain distance. The king's face darkened when Haley told him that he could continue with his business, that she was leaving. Roderick ran his hand through his hair, saying that she was a true Duncan, as she made people nervous. But then, the man replied that he wasn't talking to her. Suddenly, the king took out a bracelet and held it out to Haley. The protagonist, puzzled, accepted the jewel and asked in surprise if he was giving it to her. Roderick replied, with disgust, that the bracelet he held didn't suit her very well. Jade interrupted the conversation, saying that the king was, as usual, a bore. Usually, he doesn't even look at jewelry, but as soon as he saw the bracelet, he talked about His Majesty. And he kept it. Roderick instantly turned red and ordered Jade to shut up. At the thought that such a man had such an adorable side, the protagonist burst out laughing. The king couldn't take his eyes off the young woman's smile. His sword clattered to the floor, and he suggested to the queen that they go together. The protagonist was a little puzzled, but His Majesty explained that they were going where she was heading. Jade shouted at His Majesty that he had dragged him there. Haley laughed heartily again, as she loved watching the king and Jade. Roderick's gaze involuntarily turned to the queen, and his cheeks flushed slightly. They say that a quarrel between spouses is like cutting water with a knife. As our heroes walked down the hallway, the king asked the young woman if she was all right. And she nodded. With a frown, the king asked if she shouldn't answer with a question, and Haley repeated her doubt. Roderick replied that he was afraid to approach her, so as not to make her uncomfortable. How considerate. The protagonist, surprised, inquired why. Seriously, the king replied that he was also injured that day, because she looked at him like trash. What a pain. Haley let out a small laugh and explained that at that moment she was just surprised, seeing that His Majesty didn't hate her then. Looking at the queen, the man understood that he had been avoiding her for no reason. What a mistake. He contemplated the bracelet she gave him and begged to know if she didn't like it. Existential doubt. The protagonist replied with a smile that she liked everything and thanked him for such a wonderful gift. However, her hobby is making bracelets herself. What a coincidence. This requires a lot of dedication and effort. How admirable. Roderick took her hand and replied thoughtfully that her tastes were very strange and unusual for a girl. Haley asked him not to judge her preferences, and this clearly annoyed the king. Behind His Highness, an evil spirit appeared. However, the girl managed to deal with him without problems. After all, it is the best ornament. The king didn't understand why, but he felt his shoulders lighten. Roderick decided to ask if he could read the copy of the royal genealogy that he had recently borrowed. It is written in a language that Haley could not have studied, so the people of the Duncan family have no right to read it. But the girl replied that she was simply curious and was examining it. That means the king is informed of her every move. Most likely it was because she is the daughter of a political opponent. But in reality, the librarian feared that his words about royalty might have offended His Majesty. Roderick supposed that she still hadn't gotten used to palace life. Precisely for this reason, the man told her that in that castle there was a place called Arthur's Forest. They had just talked about genealogy, so Haley didn't understand why they were suddenly talking about that. She had a feeling she had heard of it vaguely, but perhaps it was just Haley's memories. Roderick told her that it was a sacred forest, passed down from generation to generation since the founding of the country. Neither nobles nor servants can enter Arthur's forest, except the royalty itself. Therefore, the man suggested to the young woman that they go together. Immediately, the protagonist was surprised by such a proposal. However, she immediately agreed and placed her hand in the man's outstretched palm. But Haley did not expect to see something like this. It was the first time she had seen a place so full of sacred energy, and she almost fell to her knees, ready to pray. However, Roderick most likely did not see that glow or feel anything. Until now, the protagonist thought that His Majesty would be better off away from the haunted castle. She thought that the king would instinctively want to leave this place, but Haley was completely mistaken. This castle houses Arthur's forest, the strongest shield protecting the Cayenne king from filth. So, logically, the question arises, at what point did everything go wrong? Sooner or later, the protagonist will find the answer. The evil spirits tried by all means to sneak in and reach His Majesty to induce him to commit the irreparable. But the forest shield did not let them pass. Now, the most horrible evil spirits cannot enter this forest. For the first time since the wedding, the protagonist saw such pure energy in His Majesty. Roderick proposed to the young woman to stop and take a breath. He spread a cloth on the stone so that the queen wouldn't feel too cold or get dirty. Haley was a little surprised by such care, and Roderick asked her not to come to this place without him. The girl decided to ask if he came often, and if he didn't feel something like a good air. Just as she thought, Roderick considered this place as something good. From now on, Haley begged him to come here more often, and she advised him to train more often, as he did recently with Jade. Only then will the king be able to emerge victorious in this tough battle. But now the girl speaks like someone about to disappear, and Roderick asked what she was plotting. Haley sincerely replied that she would no longer try to die, as people die when it's their turn. Therefore, she asked His Majesty to return the knife to her. The protagonist swore she would only use it to cut. After all, one bracelet is not enough. So the more things done, the better. After taking a deep breath, Roderick promised to return it, but the king still found the girl's words strange, so he insisted and asked if she was not trying to die. In other words, isn't it the same as not even striving to live? Because people die when their time comes. He hit the nail on the head. In reality, Haley has a strong desire to live. She also fought hard, but no matter how much people fight, fate cannot be avoided. A light breeze blew, and the king concluded that something strange was happening. This girl is undoubtedly Duncan, but sometimes Roderick feels like she lives in another world. Every morning, one must meditate to clear energy. Therefore, the protagonist has made this a habit. So today, the first thing Haley decided to do was start the day with meditation. The little spirit asked the girl if she would read a book today too. Haley nodded to confirm his words. She took out a book about the history of the kingdom of Cayenne, of the founding king, the bearer of the holy sword, the young Arthur. Nothing is known about his childhood. The young man rose with the holy sword and defeated the empire with divine power. Upon his fall, the Diamond families scattered. The Mellon, Russell, and Duncan families were later integrated into the new kingdom of Cayenne. King Roderick was informed that the restoration movement of the Demon Empire had been completely crushed. That's all they tell him, but the rebel forces have continued their resistance for days. One must not be complacent, one must extinguish it at the root, one way or another. The king held his head, and many began to think it was another attack of madness. A council member raised his hand and asked if the current number of border troops was not enough. Duke Duncan requested that his eldest son, Albert, be reinstated as commander of the Western Border Patrol. He was demoted 3 years ago for no reason. Currently, the Kingdom of Cayenne prioritizes a policy of southern expansion. And that is not a demotion. The late king granted Arthur Duncan an honorable position, even if it was a cheap ornament for the duke's son. Tension between the king and Duke Duncan, leader of the anti-royal faction, continued to rise. Albert slammed his palm on the table and exclaimed that this declaration was an insult from the royalty. But Roderick only asked the duke to worry about his own life. He didn't intend to forgive him, just because he was the queen's father. Immediately after, the king left the meeting room. Duke Duncan, for his part, began to tremble with rage. The protagonist was surprised to be notified of His Majesty's arrival and stopped detailing her artifact. Roderick reluctantly entered the room, saying that his father was clearly losing his mind. Lately, every time something happens, the king comes to see his majesty. Haley couldn't hold back her laughter. She was curious to know what his father had done this time to provoke such a reaction from his majesty. Roderick sat next to the queen and told her that the duke had asked for his brother to be reinstated. What a wonderful family he got with his wife. But the protagonist didn't remember any of this, so she decided to look for it in Haley's diary later. Her heart tightens just thinking about the diary. Suddenly, His Majesty asked the girl if his words bothered her. Jade, mentally and indignantly, asked if he insulted parents. Siblings, it's not a sign to go to war. But surprisingly, the girl replied that she didn't care. The king knows perfectly well that things are not so perfect in the Duncan family. Roderick remembered how ruthless the Duke was with his only daughter that day. That's why Haley's words now make sense. This girl was ridiculed as a beautiful fool. That's why Jade didn't understand why the king questioned that reputation. But in recent days, our hero is starting to understand it. The queen is not foolish at all, since she calmly accepts everything she hears from His Majesty. Roderick annoyingly told Haley that she had to look the person speaking to her in the eye. But the girl explained that if he hurts himself, he will take the knife away again. Roderick laughed and promised he wouldn't take it away, because he's not that cruel. The protagonist asked him to remember those words, because it is very important to her. His Majesty asked to be explained, to correctly understand what exactly that was. It's not as strange a thing as everyone else thought at first. However, it cannot even be considered an aesthetic ornament. Now the protagonist is carving an object, very similar to the one His Majesty holds in his hands. In reality, carving helps Haley control her mind. But the king pointed out that this hobby was not appropriate for her age. The protagonist turned her head and replied to the man that he also didn't match his age. In Haley's opinion, and even the narrator of the story, he looks very young. And he doesn't look 8 years older than his wife. The girl didn't know that Roderick secretly felt sorry for her. Faced with the man's reaction, the protagonist burst out laughing. Roderick gently pulled the girl's cheek and with childish reproach, asked how she dared to laugh at the king. Then, the protagonist extended the carved amulet towards the king, telling him that it belonged to him now. Roderick honestly replied that he wanted to kindly refuse it, but Haley decided to make this gift, putting all her heart into it. However, if the man doesn't want it at all, she can withdraw the gift. But Roderick immediately demanded that the gift be returned, because he was only joking. The protagonist asked him to put that thing under the bed. Although this talisman looks weird, it protects quite well against bad luck and nightmares. Haley made it especially so that the king could sleep well. With the heroine's talent, she cannot make an incredible amulet. But now King Roderick needs at least a little help. The girl promised that surely there will be times when the sincere prayers of others protect His Majesty. Roderick instantly blushed, but Haley knew it would be hard to achieve. This fact complicates people's lives. Before, this even afflicted the protagonist. The king ran his hand through his hair and asked the girl to stop already. She can't help saying it. The hero will accept the gift without hesitation. The protagonist asked him to wait a moment. Soon, Haley brought another amulet and begged him to take that one too. Since it's a hobby, the protagonist could make many more. One amulet would be sad alone. So the protagonist, with a big smile, begged him to take both. Indecent thoughts instantly assailed Roderick's mind. He snatched the gifts from Haley and announced his departure, asking her not to follow him. And then, the door slammed shut with a crash. The protagonist found a new object to create another amulet, leaving Jade astonished. That girl was truly peculiar. The king slept that night, with His Majesty's gifts on the nightstand. In the end, he managed to fall asleep a little, although it was a sad dream. Roderick wondered if those gifts from the queen would really have any effect. However, something like that is impossible. But even without that, Haley remained a very strange girl. This morning, to the king's surprise, it was not bad at all. Finally, Roderick left the room and moved away from the amulets, because at night, their aura bothered the evil spirits. With the arrival of morning, the protagonist meditated again. The little spirit asked the girl how long they would keep doing that, and Haley replied that she was confused today. All this was because of Haley's diary, read at dawn. Usually it was so stupid that it gave a headache, but today was different. In one of the entries, the real Haley intended to talk to Lawrence to leave everything and run away with him from Cayenne. In the diary, the heroine concluded that she was truly a fool. As everyone said, the protagonist's heart starts to ache every time she thinks about Haley's beloved. Most likely Haley loved Lawrence very much. Even after Haley's soul died, her heart remained in the body like ruins. reduced to ashes by fire. The protagonist was left wondering how Lawrence was doing. Suddenly, the girl heard a noise coming from the hallway. She asked the spirit if it could hear what they were talking about, and it replied affirmatively. The little one told her that Roderick is going crazy again, but stronger today. It hadn't happened lately, and Haley even thought that the gifted talismans hadn't had any effect. As she suspected, she won't be able to deal with this problem on her own. The heroine has seen several times shamans ruin their lives, trying to do out of pity what is beyond their reach. It would be wiser at least now to close her eyes and not get involved. Suddenly, the images of the king and Lawrence mingled in the protagonist's head. The real Haley didn't want to forget Lawrence, and the protagonist didn't want to turn her back on him either. The knights were doing their best to contain the enraged king, but the evil spirits kept whispering that he belonged to them and that he must kill someone. Finally, His Majesty calmed down a bit. The queen ran to the king of the first squadron and anxiously asked about the king's condition. It makes no sense to restrain His Majesty, so Shader replied that he is not so out of it now. But now it's better if the queen doesn't approach him. However, Haley knew that he would be fine, as Roderick is only trying to overcome a strong impulse of madness. She shouted to the king that she came today to offer him tea. This time, the tea will surely be richer. The king's condition is serious, and if we use the bracelet as usual, it will break. But there is no choice. Jade planned to take control if the situation became dangerous. He didn't understand why the queen acted in such dangerous moments without fear of her husband. Haley's body was trembling. She was still terrified of the evil spirits, but only the human heart trembles. She will be able to advance if she stays true to her intentions. He who follows the natural will prosper, and he who goes against the will perish sooner or later. Finally, the king's gaze began to clear, but strength began to rapidly abandon His Majesty's body. Now the knights could let him go calmly. The protagonist held her husband so he wouldn't collapse right there. Haley was surprised when Roderick even managed to murmur something. He repeated that today, finally, he managed to sleep well. Those ugly little wooden pieces that Haley gave him definitely had an effect. Roderick, in a pleading voice, begged the queen not to look at him like that with pity. And then, strength completely abandoned the king, and he collapsed, dragging the protagonist down with his weight. The knights helped carry the king to the reception room. The butler was in shock, because this time, His Majesty fell asleep instantly as soon as the queen arrived. Roderick slowly opened his eyes. At that moment, Haley was gently massaging the man's hand. Unexpectedly, the king asked the girl not to come near him in that state, because he couldn't guarantee her safety. Imagine the danger. But those words were too weak for someone who truly wanted to warn. The protagonist wouldn't give those figures to just anyone and knew he had his reasons. Haley reminded him that she was a Duncan and knew how to survive better than anyone. She asked him to treat her like any other Duncan, without privileges. The girl wanted to keep the temperature under control so the situation wouldn't worsen. Although she had already asked before, the king insisted again. Was she responsible? The protagonist replied that it was good to relax after hard training, because he looked exhausted. He always did it like that. She was lying a little. She hid a little more, maintaining an ambiguous distance. For some reason, the butler began to feel that His Majesty was pressuring the king much more now. Haley asked Jade since when the king has been in that state, and the commander replied that he had been feeling unwell since the morning. But the protagonist wasn't interested in that at all. She was curious to know since when he had such a bad temper. Jade replied that it happened after Roderick came to power, because after that, he started complaining of headaches. But recently, this has intensified. The protagonist didn't understand how His Majesty could endure all this for 3 years. It must be terribly hard. The king fell asleep again, and judging by how he clung to the amulet's energy, his chances are already at the limit. The protagonist asked Jade to fight with His Majesty more often, like last time. But the captain replied with doubts that the king often gets furious when he picks up a weapon. Even if Jade's words are true, Haley cannot be sure that forbidding weapons is a good idea. She convinced herself of this after hugging the king several times, because he has an innate leader's instinct. Roderick possesses the energy of a sacred emperor, which we could call fatal if he didn't try to control every attack. The protagonist wouldn't be able to contain him. I'm sure of it. To Jade's surprise, the queen asked that her husband be taken to Arthur's forest more often. To breathe, the commander remembered that the entrance to that place is forbidden to everyone except royalty, because the heroine's original memories are mixed with Haley's. The girl has a mental mess. She completely forgot about that. In the end, the protagonist returned to her room and slept all day. Yesterday, she collapsed directly onto the bed. Today, she didn't even feel like meditating a little. The bracelet is still intact, although a little damaged by recent events. Haley was sure that His Majesty would avoid her for a while, so she could take the day easy. Contrary to what the girl thought, the complete opposite happened. As soon as the king entered the room, Haley assumed that her father was talking nonsense again. Roderick asked with disgust if he needed a reason to visit his wife's room. So he just came like that, like a patient visiting the hospital regularly. The protagonist, smiling, reminded him that before he didn't even want gifts from his beloved wife. Haley, as a member of the Duncan family, did not miss an opportunity to be sharp-tongued. Since Roderick came, she proposed to the queen to drink the tea they couldn't have yesterday. While the girl drank the tea, the king had a very thoughtful expression. Unexpectedly for Haley, he asked her to come closer and do the same as in the office. The protagonist put effort using her limited skills, and Roderick saw it as needing like a cat. He told the queen that today too he couldn't fall asleep. His prayers didn't reach Roderick yesterday because she was surely thinking of someone else. But Haley still didn't understand why he was asking, even though it always seemed absurd to her. Roderick noticed that the girl was cautious, but he didn't understand the reason. She is probably hiding something, but it doesn't seem like Haley wants to harm him or the royal family. A smile appeared on his lips, and Roderick asked her why she was pretending not to understand. The guy was too insistent, so the protagonist chose to pretend and sat next to him. Immediately after, she took his hand and began to massage it. As Roderick supposed, for someone who trained so much, he didn't have many muscles, and his fingertips were soft. Her skin was fine, with calluses healed by carving, contradicting what the queen said about her hobby. Roderick strongly doubted she did anything like this before arriving at the palace. Therefore, the man didn't understand why she was lying. The king wanted to talk about it, but looking at the girl, his face instantly changed. Haley was surprised when His Majesty asked her if she was trying to seduce him. He turned and told the protagonist that the front part of his garment had come undone. The protagonist instantly blushed, not understanding how this could have happened. She shuddered when the king asked her to remove her hands. Roderick skillfully resolved that small issue. Seeing His Majesty's face, the king noticed that she was already red with embarrassment. Something like that is impossible to hide from others' eyes. The protagonist exclaimed that it was very indecent and that he should have pretended not to see anything. But Roderick didn't want others to stare too. The king proposed that she consider it his slip-up. Haley made that face again, and the king apologized immediately. Maybe she didn't like it, but he begged her not to hate him so much, because now he feels much better than before. The protagonist, blushing, admitted that she also feels much better than at the beginning. This girl clearly knew how to manipulate feelings. Haley promised herself not to do anything conspicuous again, but she tends to trip over the same stone. The next day, Kate arrived at the king's office. Roderick calmly asked if something was wrong, and the man told him about the report made. The commander of the first squadron noticed that His Majesty's health was slowly beginning to improve. The cause of death of the first woman, who became His Majesty's fiancée. It's poisoning. Until the second fiancée was poisoned, Roderick didn't know that Duke Duncan would be so obsessed with marrying into the crown. Jade revealed to the ruler that Haley has a diary she brought with her from the duchy. There are about 10 chapters, and after arriving at the palace, she writes nothing. She only opens it sometimes to read. The commander asked if he should investigate the content. For some reason, Roderick doesn't want to do it, so he decided to allow the queen at least that. The king doesn't want to be the typical man who reads his wife's youth diary. So, Roderick suggested finishing the talk about the Duncans and going to stretch his body. The spirit asked the girl why she pretended not to see him or want to talk to him. He appeared just when Haley had finally decided to rest. The protagonist begged the spirit to stop talking to her, because she just wants to live like a normal person. But for someone who says that, it seems Haley was looking for trouble herself. This ghost hits the nail on the head. Once again, the king knocked down the sword of the commander of the 1st Division. An unattainable king. Roderick annoyingly asked Jade how he could be weaker than his king, and the commander promised to try harder. The king wanted to start another round, but suddenly felt something indescribable inside him. He threw the sword aside and started running because, for some reason, he felt that she was there. The image of Haley immediately appeared in his head. But if he goes in that direction, there will be the garden next to the lake. They say Haley Duncan tried to drown herself in the river, so Roderick had a bad premonition. Since this spirit is a guardian, the protagonist decided to ask why he doesn't try to help King Roderick. The man's ghost knelt and asked the girl if he should reveal to her what sin Roderick committed. But of course, the spirit was joking because he couldn't tell her that. After all, it's a mystery of nature that the protagonist must try to discover for herself. Haley became discouraged, but her eyes immediately opened when the ghost called her by her past life name. She certainly didn't say her name, so the girl wondered how far this ghost could see. Since Kang E and the real Haley already died once each, the protagonist shouldn't be so scared. He says it as if it doesn't matter. The ghost pointed to King Roderick, thus alerting the protagonist to the arrival of her husband. But he had a worried face, and again brought with him a large army of evil spirits. Haley looked at the spirit with bewilderment when it suddenly stood up. He informed the queen that he himself would purge the current king so that she could enjoy herself. This specter was obviously powerful, because in an instant he got rid of all the evil beings. Running towards Haley, Roderick anxiously asked why she was there. Most likely this man is worried because she is near the water. With a warm smile on her face, Haley replied that she just came out for some fresh air, and she wasn't even thinking of jumping into the lake. But Roderick looked at her suspiciously. Unexpectedly, he sat down next to her. On the ground, he noticed a drawing and asked Haley if she was just fooling around drawing on the dirt. He took on an adorable expression, which made a smile bloom on the girl's face. Then, Haley suggested to His Majesty that they go to the forest, if he had finished his training there. Right now is the perfect time for a walk. Haley provoked the king more than he imagined. The protagonist shuddered when the king calmly said that she was different from what he had heard. The girl understood that she should act more convincingly, like Haley Duncan, to avoid suspicion. But right now, she was having a lot of fun being close to this man. Roderick noticed a change in the girl's mood, so he asked worriedly why she had gone silent again. If she has something to say, she should continue. Instead of answering, the protagonist asked the king to undergo regular medical checkups to stay healthy. Roderick smiled and, standing up, held out his hand for them to go to Arthur's forest together. Haley has a lot of fun with the king, but if she gets too involved, it could be dangerous for her. But if we continue to keep our distance, everything will be fine. She refused, but the king threatened to carry her, so she agreed to go, but alone. Arthur's forest is always full of sacred energy. If that man comes here, his aura will strengthen. No matter how hard Haley tries, I doubt she can clear half of his energy. She was stunned when the king suddenly lay down in her lap. After several times, he understood that this way he slept well, ignoring the real reasons. Haley annoyingly asked the king if he saw her as a personal pillow. With a sly smile, Roderick suggested to the queen that she be his blanket, not his pillow. He understands that this marriage is not something that makes Haley happy, but Roderick wanted that. At least this way, the couple would joke around. Although this relationship is far from normal and has many conflicts, the king felt comfortable. The idyllic situation broke when Roderick mentioned that next month is the annual hunt. Last year it was difficult to cancel the event, but this year it is mandatory to hold it. Unlike his wife, who loves animals, the matchmaker is crazy and will not allow it. Seeing Haley's reaction, the man confirmed once again that she loves animals. The protagonist decided to ask why the hunt was canceled last year, if the king used to go. It turns out that the hunt is actually a social gathering place. Since not only the king's people attend, many outside eyes appear around. Haley understood instantly. She doesn't want to appear like that in front of people. The king immediately wondered if this girl had grasped his worries just by hearing the story. However, she always tries to hide something, so she might worry about him that much. Roderick had never admitted his own madness, for fear of definitively becoming a mad king. But for some reason, now he feels that he will calm down if he tells everything. Precisely to her, the daughter of a political enemy who could run to her father and tell everything as soon as he shows weakness. Even knowing all those threats, Roderick wanted to tell her everything about himself. And only her. However, the protagonist covered his mouth with her hand. In a sad voice, she replied that it was not true at all. In reality, none of that is true. He is not crazy or broken. The protagonist was absolutely sure of it. A man with such clear and pure eyes simply cannot be like that. A few days later, there was another meeting where they talked about the hunting competition again. Duke Duncan decided to ask the king if he was feeling unwell, like the most loyal dog. Roderick still didn't understand how such a beautiful daughter could come from such a repugnant man. He didn't understand why he had to see his wife's face in that scoundrel. Raising his hand, Roderick asked Jade to give him that document, as he had something for his father-in-law. It turned out to be an anonymous denunciation about the discrepancy between the Duke's royal income and the taxes paid. Now the royal family could start an investigation to find out more about this. Roderick asked to be allowed to respond to those words again. He would like Duke Duncan to stop tarnishing the Queen's reputation. The king will give his father-in-law only one chance to fix everything before the official inspection. Furthermore, Roderick added that the hunting tournament next month will take place as planned. He left, and Duke Duncan fought with all his might to suppress his anger at the failure. In the darkness of the night, the protagonist was in her room carving another amulet for His Majesty. As soon as she finished, Roderick, who had been lying on her bed the whole time, suggested to the girl that she lie down with him. After Arthur's last visit to the forest, the king sleeps in Haley's room whenever he has the chance. To top it off, it's the cleanest room in the entire castle. Without waiting for an answer, Roderick got out of bed and headed towards the protagonist. She was stunned when he, without much effort, picked her up in his arms, and then sat her on the bed, telling her that he would sleep on the sofa if she felt uncomfortable with him. But how could she force him to sleep on the sofa when he had barely found a comfortable place? So the girl allowed him to sleep in the bed. The king seemed to be waiting for that and immediately lay down next to her. He confessed that he was truly happy that his wife wasn't insensitive and didn't make him sleep on the sofa. Suddenly, Roderick leaned over her and asked Haley if she knew what she would have to do when they slept in the same bed. With a sly smile on his face, the man suggested doing it right now. Haley blushed deeply, and her heart began to beat fast. Roderick noticed that Haley had frozen at his suggestion, unable to do or say anything, so he lay down next to her again, saying it was just a joke and that she shouldn't have trouble refusing. In reality, Haley would also like to do it, but for some reason she cannot say it, and she is an expert on ghosts. Roderick perfectly understood that she needed to mentally prepare herself, because there was someone whom Haley loved so much that she would throw herself into the water for him, and he will be at the competition. We are talking about Sir Lawrence. The next day, the king read the report about his wife's beloved, whose name he had already heard. And Lawrence is a knight with an exceptional reputation in the kingdom. Before his marriage to Haley, this didn't worry the king at all. Also on the table was the report of Haley's investigation prior to the marriage. So Roderick decided to reread it. But upon reviewing the report on the queen again, he concluded that it made no sense from start to finish. So he started railing against Shade for doing his job so irresponsibly. The king ordered everything to be checked again, and the report submitted before the hunt ends. Roderick didn't understand why it bothered him so much, and concluded it was because of his suspicions about Haley. Now the girl wanders near the lake without escort. That's why the king ordered Jade to watch the queen closely. A few days later, the protagonist was determined to carry out an important matter. The spirit behind her suddenly asked what she was looking at so intently, making the girl shudder. In reality, she was looking for him, to ask him to watch the king during the hunt, and help him if necessary. However, the ghost couldn't agree to such a request, as it is ridiculous for a human to try to make a deal with a spirit. If this castle were full of evil creatures, they would have already pounced on the protagonist, ruining her life. Haley agreed, but knew she couldn't handle this alone. She tried to embroider a handkerchief instead of an amulet, but it was useless. It didn't ward off spirits. There is no remedy. She doesn't have enough power, so she will have to make several. Putting all her soul and a lot of good wishes into them, the protagonist didn't sleep for nights, and she constantly prayed to give the amulet some power. Suddenly, before leaving, the spirit asked the girl to simply enjoy life and live in the moment. In the end, it won't help. There is barely any time left for the house competition, so now the girl must keep making handkerchiefs. Upon waking up, Haley's head started to spin. In recent days, she exhausted so much energy that now she has almost no strength left. The problem is that the protagonist told Deborah not to follow her, so now she is alone in this place. Strength completely left the girl, and she lost consciousness. The king exclaimed indignantly that this could be interpreted as a protest against him. The protagonist tried to explain, once again, that he had no such intentions at all. Jade found Haley unconscious and brought her to this room. Roderick asked, with disgust, how many times this had happened since she arrived at the palace. Haley laughed, although in reality, counting how many times the king went mad would be enough to get the correct answer. Starting to mess up the girl's hair, the man asked if she couldn't just say she was in pain. He perfectly understood that she hated this marriage, but Haley immediately replied that it wasn't like that, since in reality, she simply decided to resign herself and accept her fate. But the king was not sure of those words, so he asked Haley to say his name. The protagonist felt uncomfortable, but still replied that her name was Roderick Ferris Blake. She knows everything perfectly, and for some reason has never called him by his name. Haley's eyes widened in astonishment as soon as the king allowed her to call him Roderick. Or Rod. The protagonist thanked him for such an honor, but refused, saying she would continue to call him by his title. Roderick didn't understand what was wrong with her, and the girl, hiding under the blanket, explained that they should maintain more distance. He immediately asked if it was a secret Duncan technique to hurt someone with a single word. And Haley laughed. The king definitely liked this girl. Every time she tries to keep her distance, the king got irritated, but when she laughed, his mood immediately improved. Calming down, Haley decided to ask His Majesty if it was true that he would go to the hunting competition. He was a little surprised that the girl still cared about that, for her love of animals, apparently. But Roderick didn't expect at all that the queen would offer to break even one hand to cancel everything, or at least one leg, which made the man burst out laughing. With such delicate wrists, Haley couldn't break even a finger. The protagonist realized, in the end, there is no other way than with handkerchiefs. Upon hearing those words, the king immediately asked if she would really give him a handkerchief at the next house competition. Haley asked in surprise if he thought her words were a lie. But the girl didn't understand why the king wanted to receive a handkerchief from her if it was useless. Roderick ruffled her hair again, saying that she was simply trying to say that she didn't want to give him the handkerchief. He informed the girl that this conversation had caused a wound in his soul. The protagonist promised to give the handkerchief, so His Majesty shouldn't doubt her. Roderick wondered if he shouldn't doubt that she would give the handkerchief or that she was hiding something. Haley jumped out of bed and exclaimed that it wasn't a lie. She pointed to a pile of handkerchiefs. In reality, Roderick thought she was just protecting her feelings, but it seems she decided to give everything to someone else. The man supposed that the queen's health had suffered because she made them. If you look closely, Haley's hands are also full of scratches. When she keeps her distance, it starts to make him very angry. But when she laughs, Roderick's soul also warms up. He doesn't like Haley risking her health for some simple handkerchiefs, but he is happy that she wants to keep her promise. The man leaned over her again and asked her to rest, because she was very pale. In a serious tone, he offered his arm as a pillow. The protagonist had never leaned on an arm, so she hesitated whether it was right to do so. Roderick asked her to come closer, because if she leaned on his wrist, the blood wouldn't circulate well. Although she was very embarrassed, the girl approached anyway. For the king, all this is strange, because sometimes the girl seems lonely and sad. Perhaps it was because her father Duncan beat her. He didn't understand how such a small creature could be hit. Haley froze as soon as the man said they had a problem. Roderick didn't understand why she always looked at the lake with that somber expression, as if she wanted to die. The protagonist, confused, asked why he cared so much about that. The king held her tightly, reminding her that she was his wife and shouldn't ask the obvious, even if Haley had to pay a very high price for this warmth. She didn't want to stop, not even a little. So the problem was His Majesty, who took away the heroine's option to pretend not to notice anything. Since Haley didn't answer, the man asked her to fall asleep quickly. Enough was enough. She thanked him for not asking any more questions. Finally, some peace. Time flew by, and the day of the great hunting competition arrived. The maid adorned His Majesty, assuring that the king would win upon seeing her like this. But Haley wished he would come in last and not kill anyone, not a single animal. She took 3 embroidered handkerchiefs, the best ones, to give to His Majesty. Roderick supposed that Haley had finished getting ready. Among the crowd, the king quickly located Lawrence. Haley's beloved was looking everywhere, as if searching for someone. Then, the king also spotted Haley. Roderick smiled, supposing that it must be difficult for her to live in this world being so small. The protagonist held out 3 handkerchiefs to him and explained that it would be better to keep them with him during the competition. The king accepted the gift, and Haley found it adorable how he crumpled them with his large hands. Somewhat embarrassed, Roderick asked the girl what he should hunt for her. Haley started to protest, but the king explained that there are no fools who go home and return empty-handed. At that moment, Lawrence saw Haley and ran towards her. The king concluded that his wife simply didn't want him to win. The competition is, essentially, a competition. Haley would like to ask her husband to be gentler and not hurt his pride, but she will remain silent. Because now Roderick is sitting on the throne, so the only thing the young woman could say was not to hurt himself and return safe and sound. Hearing a noise behind him, the king turned abruptly. In the crowd, he saw Lawrence, who was trying to approach them. Just by looking at the real Haley's beloved, the protagonist began to cry without realizing it. Memories began to flash through her head instantly. The protagonist begged for this to end. The queen cries, looking at her former love, which could put King Roderick in a bad position. The man instantly jumped off his horse and immediately hugged Haley, anxiously asking her if she was all right. The tears wouldn't stop, so the protagonist began to apologize to the king for her mistake. But Roderick didn't understand why she was crying and apologizing, as if she had committed a terrible sin. Haley smiled when the man replied that she was very cunning, because she hid quickly, and few people saw her tears. People began to think that His Majesty had cried, because he would not be able to see the king for several days. Roderick asked Haley to lift her head as if nothing had happened. He suggested creating a broader topic of conversation among the crowd, which would overshadow this incident. The king's lips slowly began to approach the girl's lips. All of this is the responsibility of Roderick and Duke Duncan, and the king was ready to admit it. He asked with a smile if he could count on her cooperation, knowing it was just an excuse. The protagonist closed her eyes. At that moment, the protagonist's lips met in a gentle kiss. That moment lasted for a few seconds. As soon as Roderick reluctantly pulled away, he admitted that it was actually just one reason, simply because he desired it. Now he must leave, so the king asked the young woman to return and be careful. All this time, Lawrence was watching our heroes. Although His Majesty said everything was fine, he actually did it to protect her. The protagonist felt grateful, so she decided to catch up with him. As soon as Roderick stopped, the girl handed him her bracelet. The man smiled and asked if she was giving him what she cherished so much again, ending up with nothing. However, Haley replied that His Majesty should return the jewels right after returning. For now, the heroine couldn't do anything else about it. Roderick laughed softly and thanked his wife for lending him something so valuable to her. His gaze fell again on Haley's beautiful lips. A strong desire to kiss the girl once more arose within him, but the man managed to suppress it and headed towards his knights. Watching the man walk away, the protagonist began to beg the gods for his safe return. And safe. With the arrival of night, it was decided to make a stop. Roderick, looking at Lawrence, asked Jade with disgust if he should just shoot that guy. Duke Duncan probably thought about making his daughter queen since her birth. That's why she couldn't dream of another man. The report said that Lawrence broke up with Haley first, and for some reason, that infuriated the current king terribly. Jade supposed that happened because he felt the burden when rumors began to circulate about a state marriage. They couldn't continue a secret relationship, so Lawrence decided to end everything at the right moment. The king remembered Haley's expression, which seemed to indicate that everything was not over yet. Roderick decided to ask Jade to hunt for him. Now he must catch more animals than Albert Duncan, so that the Duke stops talking about his son. And above all, Jade must catch more animals than Lawrence, the best swordsman in Cayenne. Looking at the sky, the king wondered, what is she busy with now? At dawn the next day, the protagonist decided to show respect to King Roderick. She mentally uttered the necessary words. Everything went much easier than the last time, and the protagonist was sure that her grandmother would be proud. Once the meditation is finished, the next step is to get rid of this sheet. On it is written a 5-point list of important tasks that worry her greatly. It was the 5th day of the hunting competition. Jade was trying his best, while the Cayenne king simply lay under a tree. However, all this time, Roderick was intently studying the queen's treasure, and he noticed that the patterns on the bracelet and the handkerchief were very similar. He turned as soon as one of the knights informed him that a small chipmunk had fallen into his trap. The fur of this animal is popular nowadays for decorating cloaks, so it can be added to the prey. But this was no ordinary chipmunk. Roderick didn't understand if she was asking him to come closer, or if she didn't want them to approach her. Is she sad, or is everything all right? Jade looked at His Majesty with disgust as soon as he ordered him to prepare a cage for the chipmunk. It was decided to take this pea to the queen. Roderick already wanted to see the smile on Haley's face, and reminded himself once more that only 2 days remained. From the diary, the protagonist discovered that Lawrence advised the real Haley not to run away, but to create other relationships. He said he would become the queen's knight, and thus they could always be together. But the duke's daughter knew that wouldn't work. Now, if Haley's soul hadn't left this place yet, the protagonist wanted to comfort her and help her find peace. So, as the sixth item on the list, she wrote visiting the arm where Haley threw herself. While reading the diary further, the girl discovered that her father was going to do something terrible, and Haley wanted to stop him. However, she didn't want to be slapped again. Judging by the diary, traces of Haley's attempts to understand the Duke can be seen. Since she was a kind-hearted child, neither protagonist had luck with their parents. From the last page of the diary, it is deduced that she stopped writing a month before she died. Recently, the protagonist vividly recalled Haley's childhood. Now that she thinks about it, she remembers many things from childhood, but the memories of the last few years are very blurry. The king praised his captain for crushing that fool Duncan and the conceited peacock Lawrence. In the end, His Majesty suffered not a single attack. Suddenly, the chipmunk in the cage started to squeak very loudly. The king turned abruptly, ordered all soldiers to disperse, and threw his sword in fury. It turns out that all this time, a venomous snake was approaching, but Roderick managed to save his subordinates. Its bite is so venomous that it can even kill a horse. The king congratulated the little one for giving the signal. Now they can leave again, because Haley is already waiting. Soon the men will reach the forest entrance. Since the closing ceremony will take place at night, they will let the horses rest. Roderick's eyes widened when he saw a familiar person right at the forest exit. His horse instantly bolted towards her. The protagonist, with a wide smile on her face, greeted His Majesty. Roderick instantly picked Haley up in his arms and began to spin happily, while she congratulated him on his return. The girl was immensely happy that he had returned in his right mind, and that all her efforts were not in vain. A little later, Roderick handed Haley a chipmunk. Haley didn't understand why he brought someone who lived peacefully in nature. This little creature was doomed to die, but it found a noble man who saved its life. The little one immediately jumped towards the protagonist. It bit everyone, but it was kind to Haley, and surely the protagonist's aura calmed it down. Roderick returned the girl's bracelet to her. Noticing the happy smile on Haley's face, the king joked that he was happier about that jewel than about him. Suddenly, right in front of her, the protagonist saw an evil snake spirit. Haley was completely paralyzed with fear. In a trembling voice, she asked His Majesty if he had killed a snake in the competition. And he nodded. Taking a breath, Haley replied that she shouldn't have killed it. It turns out that snakes hold a lot of grudges, and unlike other spirits, they remember who killed them. But the biggest problem is that the protagonist is terribly afraid of them. Haley covered her face with her hands so as not to see the spirit, and pitifully asked the king why he couldn't walk. Although mentally she understood that it was an inevitable situation, so she just had to gather her courage. However, the girl couldn't overcome it, and cursing her luck, she ran away from the king's side at full speed. Roderick, in shock, didn't even understand if the girl meant him or the snake. The house competition ended, and as expected, Jade claimed victory, glorifying King Roderick. The chipmunk that Roderick brought settled on the shore of the castle lake. It seemed like calm days were coming, but the protagonist's worries intensified every day. Haley couldn't leave her room for fear of running into that disgusting thing. And that's why she hadn't seen the king for 4 days. Suddenly, Jade knocked on the queen's door and asked for permission to enter. The protagonist froze the instant the room door opened. Roderick's eyes snapped open, not understanding why he was lying down, when he was sure he was working sitting in his office. He looked at Haley in surprise when he realized he was lying in her lap. We go back in time, 4 days ago, right after the house competition ended. Roderick was sure that the queen hated him, because a wound in the soul takes a long time to heal. Instead of insisting on his pessimism, Yad suggested going to see His Highness and clearing everything up. To be honest, Roderick didn't know how to act after seeing her cry sadly for another man. As he said before, the responsibility for this marriage falls entirely on him and Duke Duncan. Therefore, the man didn't want to force her. But the days kept passing, and the king's mental state worsened. He hadn't slept during all this time and was now at his limit. Roderick started hearing voices in his head again, whispering to kill someone. Jade didn't know why, but he saw that the king calmed down a lot around Her Majesty. But he remained stubborn. Suddenly, Roxanne banged her head on the table and shouted words of cursing. Maybe His Majesty persisted like this because of what was between the queen and Sir Lawrence. But Jade couldn't keep watching this, and that's how the king ended up in the protagonist's room. Roderick realized that the air was different there, and the cursed voices in his head had disappeared. He annoyingly reminded the girl that he couldn't sleep without her. The protagonist confessed that she also wanted to see him and was somewhat worried about it. Like an offended child, Roderick begged her to visit him from time to time. Roderick's bedroom was paramount, so the protagonist had to go there, yes. Or yes. Surprisingly, the king felt a lightness in his body. Many believe that arcane magic is a myth, but it is recorded in the royal archives. Roderick asked her if she had studied medicine, and Haley replied with a smile that no. The hero confessed to her that when he was near her, his mind cleared up. Although the protagonist wanted to tell everything, fear paralyzed her. She feared being treated differently, so she simply begged His Majesty to use her for his purposes. Roderick held the girl's hand and suggested kissing her again. He didn't expect at all that Haley would kiss him right on the cheek. The king suddenly stood up, and with a touch of indignation, asked if she was a fox. The man pulled her towards him and suggested trying once more, because he wanted to check something. The instant Haley cried, Roderick felt a crazy desire to kiss her. Therefore, he was going to make sure of something. The king really couldn't refuse that, so he laid the girl on the bed and she affectionately hugged him. Roderick intertwined their fingers on purpose, so that his hands wouldn't start wandering uncontrollably. Regardless of his will, this kiss was different from the previous one, because for some reason, the protagonist felt desperation in it. In any case, that was too direct. As soon as he ran out of air, the king moved away a little. He was able to verify his theory. That girl became special to him. He didn't even manage to understand when his heart grew so much. Unexpectedly, the man decided to ask Haley if she loved Lawrence very much. Just hearing the name, the protagonist's soul saddened. So the real Haley still hurts to hear that name. It seems so, the girl replied to the king. Roderick decided not to rush so that Haley could resolve everything and forget Lawrence. Instead, he offered the heroine his hand as a pillow. The king said this with the excuse that she should come closer, and they could snuggle together. Haley perfectly understood that King Roderick was trying to shorten the distance between them. But the closer they get to her, the worse they start treating her. And if that person hates her, she definitely won't be able to stand it. But there is no point in talking about it, because it is not Roderick's fault. He just shouldn't treat her so well. The king hugged the young woman tighter, realizing that she had now settled in his heart for a long time. In this position, our heroes are, and in the middle of the night the heroine woke up, because for some reason she felt an unpleasant energy. She shuddered as soon as she saw an evil spirit outside the window. The protagonist immediately jumped out of bed to deal with it as soon as possible. It was the ghost of a drunkard, who begged for alcohol even though Haley kindly asked him to leave. Therefore, the young woman coldly ordered him to stop talking nonsense. She was ready to give him a final warning or simply destroy him if he approached that person again. In the end, the spirit left and Haley, exhausted, fell to her knees. To solve the main problem, one must achieve enlightenment or destroy. But fighting a ghost is too much. However, Haley wanted to provide that person with a peaceful night, which everyone deserves. One must try to fight at least once. So the protagonist ran to the painting and started tearing off all the amulets stuck underneath. The little spirit immediately began to protest, because if the barrier broke, the evil spirits would come in again. But one cannot run away like that, so now Haley is determined to confront. As soon as the protection was removed, an evil snake spirit appeared at the door. It was much larger than the protagonist expected. The little spirit instantly knew that Haley couldn't handle that creature, so it decided to help. The protagonist was amazed when the little one pounced on the head of the enormous and evil snake. However, she immediately felt the spirit's power weaken, so she decided not to waste time. Haley quickly performed the purification ritual, demanding that the creature forget the sorrows of this world and go home. Thanks to the help of her little friend, Haley succeeded, but decided that never again in her life would she kill snakes. She collapsed on the bed, offering the little spirit a place to sleep. The next morning dawned, and the king finally woke up after a good rest. However, he noticed that Haley was pale and asked if she had a nightmare. Come to think of it, the girl slept on the other side last night. So Roderick started to think that he had turned her in his sleep. If only this were really just a dream. The guy immediately asked Haley, did she not like kissing him? But instead of answering, the girl insisted that he should never kill snakes again. After all, they have hate, whom they can ask to solve anything. For some reason, the commander of the first squadron felt that he was being tasked with heavy work again. Roderick understood the girl's request and the protagonist thanked him for listening to her. When the fourth king ruled, he sent a letter to future rulers to be careful about the secret powers of the three houses. In another meeting, Duke Duncan begged His Majesty again to reinstate his son on the western border. Roderick let out a small laugh and asked, "Are you seriously talking about the one who couldn't even catch half the animals in the competition?" Then, the Duke decided to inform the king that he had already tried to discuss this matter with the Queen several times, and she always rejects it. But Roderick warned Haley's father not to gossip about the Queen. He didn't force her to prohibit anything, so he shouldn't complain publicly right now. As soon as the meeting ended, Roderick wondered how a father could know his daughter so little. Unexpectedly, his gaze fell on Haley. Unlike her relatives, this girl was very different from all the Duncans. The protagonist was very happy to see the king, who was about to walk down to her at that instant. Roderick became curious to know what the Queen was carving this time. The protagonist told him that it would be those things he had given her the previous time. The man remembered that those strange statuettes he had recently received had already deteriorated quite a bit, even though they were new. Therefore, he decided to buy Haley better quality wood so she could play as much as she wanted. Roderick said that he got stressed at the meeting and came to clear his head. The protagonist immediately understood that her father had caused some entanglement again. The king deduced that he didn't like the Duncan family and wondered why the Duke wanted to see her so much. Suddenly, Haley said she planned to meet with the Duke and do whatever His Majesty wished. When asked why, the girl replied that the king could use her for whatever he wanted, which infuriated the man. Roderick coldly asked if he had been so cold to her that she used those words. It seems he doesn't like the word use. The girl's face darkened at the thought that the king had completely gotten tired of her. Seeing this, the man took a deep breath. He thought that when she went silent, everything became even more difficult for him. The king proposed to stop this small dispute because he regrets everything. Then he gently touched her, and then pulled her towards him and kissed her. Haley slightly parted her lips, and the king immediately licked her lower lip with his tongue. Lately, it has become very important to him what not only the girl feels, but also her soul. Therefore, with a childish pout, he asked if she was all right. The protagonist, embarrassed, replied that she was fine and that she liked everything. Roderick apologized because he was the first one today to talk about the Duke. However, then he unexpectedly asked his dear wife if she would kiss him several times a day. Since she likes it, she could do it at least once. Haley decided to play deaf, as if nothing had happened. At those moments she seems so naive, although the coldness in her heart persists. The more Jade investigated, the more questions he asked himself about the case. Now he has no choice but to ask that individual for cooperation. By order of the commander, Lawrence arrived at his office to answer questions about the Queen. Soon the king learned that Lawrence Irwin had also reviewed the report on the Queen. The commander of the first squadron of knights explained that they needed him to fulfill the order. Now the report reveals many details, and after exhaustive reviews, the investigation was expanded. However, the content does not differ much from the previous one. Everyone around Haley, even childhood friends with whom she lost contact, gave the same testimony about her. Even Sir Lawrence was bewildered by his suspicions about the report. But Roderick remained annoyed that Haley's beloved was involved. In the report, he saw that the girl asked for a new dress at least once a week and hummed songs incessantly. The king asked Shade if he really believed this was about his queen. At that precise moment, the protagonist was sitting by the lake. A spirit emerged from the water with a sly smile and asked if she was expecting him today. Haley, without saying a word, pointed to the people behind her. Although she asked to be left alone, after she fainted last time, the king does not allow it. The protagonist decided to ask the ghost if he really wasn't going to help, because she didn't think she could do it alone, and most likely she would die first. The spirit suggested she stop doing something, but Haley refused, and the spirit noticed that her opinion of the king had improved. So far he has done well, so she can keep trying even harder. The protagonist wanted to answer, but the man quickly disappeared. Suddenly, Roderick appeared by her side and asked if she had decided to show him her protest. If the girl wants me to fill this lake with earth, she can keep coming here. But in reality, he was worried because he thought she had returned to the lake. But everything seems to be fine. It would be great if she could openly ask the questions that interest her. But then Haley would move even further away from him. And that is what the king least wants. The man sat down next to her and asked her to sing, but Haley immediately refused, claiming she didn't know how to do it. Roderick planned to take out his anger on Jade next time, because of that stupid report. Then he touched Haley's cheek and suggested they kiss. But this time, she had to take the initiative. The protagonist offered no resistance and approached His Majesty first. Then she slowly moved away. With a radiant smile, the king proposed having dinner together that night, and she, obviously, accepted. She failed again with her disturbing list. However, she decided to try again and asked the king if she could go to his bedchamber tonight. The man blushed intensely upon hearing those words. Just in case, the king decided to ask a question. Guessing her thoughts, the protagonist flatly denied everything. Accepting that answer, Roderick told her she didn't need permission. If the spirit wouldn't help her, she had no choice. Her first step would be the royal bedchamber. As night fell, she headed towards him, albeit with great reluctance. A terrifying aura permeated the place, and she really didn't want to enter. But she couldn't give up. She had come prepared with all kinds of amulets. Roderick was surprised to see the little girl inspecting his room. He picked her up in his arms and asked if she would visit him more often in exchange for gifts. And then Roderick laid her on the bed, begging his husband for time. The protagonist blushed and quickly moved away from the monarch. On the bedside table, she saw 2 amulets he had once given her. Time had clearly beaten them, making them black. Those statuettes are now proof that the king's night was hard. The protagonist promised to make new ones soon and discard these, as they would break. Haley decided to ask His Majesty if he had ever committed a great sin. This situation is inexplicable, unless there is a sin that deserves such punishment. The man replied that among those who ascended the throne, they would hesitate to deny it. The protagonist confessed that she is not such a good person either. These words made Roderick laugh, as he couldn't believe it. Haley recounted that she once got very offended by someone and blamed them for everything. Maybe that person had their reasons, but the protagonist didn't care to know them. One day she felt pity for people again, but the more she did, the lonelier she felt. There is no remedy but to deal with all your internal feelings so as not to accumulate bad karma. Realizing this, the girl immediately apologized for talking too much about boring things. However, right now, Roderick felt as if someone had entered his heart. Although it soon disappeared without a trace, he took the statuettes in his hands and proposed naming both of them. Although only for an instant, the man managed to see the girl's true personality, and that pleased him greatly. The protagonist decided to call one of the amulets Haley, and the second mentally named him Jai-Hai. Now, even if the statuette named Haley breaks, Roderick won't be able to throw it away. He is talking about Haley's name, not Jai-Sai. The protagonist didn't even understand what was happening, because she never thought of it. Seeing the girl's sad face, the king wondered if he had said something wrong. She keeps making a sad face, constantly making Roderick question himself. The man decided to change the subject and asked when she would keep her promise. The protagonist burst out laughing when the king proposed a negotiation. This also brought a warm smile to Roderick's face. He locked the protagonist's hands and raised them above her head. Haley started to doubt it was a joke, so she kicked her husband. The king sat close and confessed that today he would surely be able to fall asleep instantly, even in this room. The warmth flowing through his body and soul was enough reward for what he would do today. As soon as the man fell asleep, the protagonist cast a spell on him. She could not, under any circumstances, allow him to wake up during the process. Then, the girl went to the center of the hall and proposed that a line be formed to vent deep grudges. But there were no volunteers, because evil spirits detect weaknesses instantly. Better not to mess with them. She had to hide her fear and show unshakable fortitude. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered the amulets that were on the nightstand. She ran to them and grabbed them instantly. Her husband's voice echoed in her mind, saying he didn't want to get rid of the gift with his wife's name. Therefore, the girl left one statuette in its place. Although the protagonist doubted whether she could defeat that huge evil spirit, she decided to try. The ghost started shouting, calling the girl a shrew. But she is the guardian who protects the king every night, so she will do her best to fulfill her mission. And in the end, she succeeded. It was a good fight, but she cannot repeat it twice in one night, so she will deal with the other spirits later. Now the amulet looks even more terrifying. They share names and suffering, which brought a bitter smile to the girl's face. However, she felt a heaviness in her heart. The next day dawned. As soon as Roderick woke up, he checked once more that he can fall asleep anywhere if the queen is near. Looking at the statuette, he wondered if it was really that deteriorated. A few days later, King Roderick had a new hobby, sleeping in Haley's room. After spending the night in the king's room, the protagonist realized something new. She lived in such a place unprepared and unprotected, which shows incredible willpower. But Haley didn't want to leave him alone in that room and asked him every day to sleep with her. The king yearned to get closer to Haley and didn't want to break their embraces, knowing nothing. But each time, the girl hesitated more whether she could afford such a luxury. In relationships, sincerity is key. But Haley was hiding too much. One day, she took another walk by the lake. That strange spirit didn't appear again, and the protagonist started to think she had been too insistent. Suddenly, there was Lawrence, right in front of her. The real Haley's feelings began to awaken upon seeing him approach so quickly. The protagonist knew it. She needed to run away. In fast, but her legs refused to move. The knight leaned down, apologizing for his rudeness towards his majesty. He begged the queen to grant him at least one chance to speak with her. In the end, the girl agreed, and they were left alone. Lawrence only wanted to ask one question. The protagonist immediately noticed the sincerity and concern in his eyes. But those feelings should be for the real Haley, not for her. Lawrence heard that the day before his wedding to the queen, an accident occurred that almost killed her. He wanted to know if this had happened because of her. He didn't understand why she would do something so terrible if he had already given his promise. Lawrence wanted to be with her as a knight, but the protagonist replied that he shouldn't. The relationship between them had ended a long time ago. If Lawrence doesn't abandon his hopes, Haley won't be able to rest in peace either. The blonde man asked, confused, why then was she crying now? The protagonist didn't realize it again. She fled, carried away by the real Haley's feelings, knowing she would never have that love. But for some reason, the girl wanted to leave behind such a precious person. As always, the king found out that the heroine had cried today. Roderick asked angrily if she planned to keep deceiving him with her ex, but she said it was absurd. For some reason, this infuriated the king to the core. He didn't understand how she could love that scoundrel so much, who now shed tears so easily just by looking at him. But it was a common misunderstanding. Haley reminded the king that he had promised not to pressure her, and Roderick replied that he only asked her not to go there. However, earlier the king had said he wouldn't pay attention to her. Squinting his eyes, Roderick asked if the situation was the same now as it was then. He asked the girl if her feelings were the same now as before. Faced with that serious and stern expression, the protagonist couldn't help but laugh. She apologized to Roderick and admitted that she didn't want to see that guy at all. The man stretched her cheek and asked her not to make that face, because Roderick starts to think something bad has happened. As soon as they finished lunch, the king told her he wanted to sleep in her room tonight, but Haley still has to deal with a monster. So she proposed to Roderick to sleep in his room while she went to hers. If they sleep separately, they won't have to worry about him waking up in the middle of the process. The king, somewhat hurt, asked if she was taking revenge for his words. He really couldn't sleep without her, and every time he heard those words, the protagonist's heart shuddered. Roderick wanted to sleep together, but if she really didn't like it, they could call it punishment for infidelity. Haley replied with a warm smile that a punishment couldn't be that comforting. With a deep sigh, the man asked if she was doing it on purpose. The protagonist was stunned when he pushed her against the nearest wall. She didn't expect at all that he would want to kiss her right in the hallway of that castle. However, Haley immediately responded to the kiss, which made her heart beat faster every time. Several minutes had already passed, and the protagonist was beginning to feel like he would devour her. As soon as she started running out of air, the king moved away slightly. And then, unexpectedly, he sharply turned Haley with her back to him and hastily led her towards the door of her room. As she had said, today they would sleep separately, because Roderick felt he would soon lose his mind. And then the man left in a hurry. Haley has to exorcise His Majesty's room, but today everything went wrong from the start. Soon everyone knew that His Majesty, the Queen, had authorized an audience. She almost always responded, with a smile, that she would convey all proposals to His Majesty the King. Deborah explained to the Queen that if she didn't like something, she could simply get angry. Suddenly, a man entered the throne room and said from the door that it was very difficult to see her lately. Duke Duncan apologized for not having arranged an appointment in advance. The maid whispered that he had arrived suddenly, saying he wanted to speak with His Majesty. Still, Haley wanted to meet with him at least once. The young woman's father immediately asked when she planned to take someone from the paternal home. The heroine replied that she didn't need it. Then, the Duke demanded that the king reinstate his brother in office. Finally, but Haley only replied that he himself should take care of it. The Duke barely suppressed his growing fury and asked to speak alone. Deborah gestured, indicating that it was not a good idea. However, His Majesty agreed and asked to be left alone. In the end, everyone present left the throne room. Albert, with contained rage, snapped at her. "What the hell are you doing? He is doing nothing for his family, which is collapsing at this precise moment. Duke Duncan is not her father, so his anger is in vain. No one knows that the real Haley died, and she won't rest until she sees him angry." So the girl reminded the Duke that she had never asked him to make her queen. But in the end, he himself destroyed his daughter's life. Albert shouted that she would regret it, because if the family collapses, she won't be saved either. In a soft voice, Haley begged her father to stop doing evil, even if only now. Without answering anything, the Duke left the throne room. Shortly after, the king learned that his queen had grumbled again today, showing her temper. The protagonist remembered that she had already said she possessed uncontrollable anger inside. Roderick asked her if she hated her father very much, and the girl replied that she preferred to ignore him. But now it's as if she's trying to hide her true feelings. Therefore, the king decided to confess that she seemed very curious to him. The protagonist didn't expect such a declaration, so she blushed intensely instantly. Then, the man decided to show her something, so the characters had to go up the large spiral staircase of the tower. Roderick remembered that Haley was interested in King Arthur. In fact, she even borrowed the royal genealogy to read it. The first king believed that a divine force protected the royal family. In this tower were the portraits of all the previous kings, so Roderick wanted to show them to Haley. In the portrait of the founding King Cayenne, the protagonist recognized the man, as his spirit constantly haunted her. Haley sat on the street, assimilating the information. It turns out that that spirit was the king, and unexpectedly he appeared in front of the girl, telling her that he died at almost 40 years old. Haley screamed in fright, and the man told her that he had managed to retain his charm until the day of his death. He is still so shameless today. But the protagonist didn't understand how he managed to look so young at 40. The ex-king mysteriously replied that the ability to decide is the beauty of human existence. Those who drown in resentment become vengeful spirits, and those who had great ideals break the rules. Haley didn't know what his ideals were, but as a guardian spirit, he could help a little. But the dead are forbidden from interfering in the affairs of the living. The first king warned the girl that, at this rate, she would soon die. The protagonist exclaimed indignantly that he felt no attachment to his descendants. The ghost's appearance transformed and reminded the queen who she was talking to. An armed conflict broke out on the western border. The knights managed to suppress it, and now there is calm on the border. The king brusquely remembered that he had already ordered the suppression of any attempt at a revival of Daimon. And now, the commander let his guard down and allowed a surprise attack. Albert, with a cunning smile, suggested to the king that he hold the commander of the Western Guard responsible. But Roderick asked for calm, assuring that he would react properly upon receiving the detailed report. Finally, the king ordered Jade to leave for the west. However, the commander was not happy with the decision, fearing another fit of rage from the king. But upon remembering the queen, his panic eased a little. During the reign of the fourth king, marriages were arranged with 3 great houses to unite the peoples. He was referring to the Mellon, Russell, and Duncan. The roots of the Duncan family date back to Daimon, and right there in the west. Their forces resurge. And for some reason, the Duke started talking about his son. The previous king was right to suspect a conspiracy with the Diamonds. The question was whether Duncan still retained so much influence. They became great diamond nobles thanks to a special power, which disappeared after the 5th king. Roderick immediately ordered the queen to be brought, even if she didn't want to. The man couldn't entrust the West to Albert Duncan. The protagonist brought with her the gift she had talked about before. Although Roderick reminded himself not to trust the Duncans, he couldn't resist the charm of that beautiful young woman. Her creation caused him to burst into laughter, and he asked her to keep filling this world with those strange creatures. Then, the king suggested going to sleep. However, from the beginning, everything went terribly wrong. Roderick laid Haley on the bed, and their lips melted in a passionate kiss. And insatiable, reacting quickly, the protagonist pushed the king away because she hadn't come for that. In reality, the girl was very embarrassed. Roderick muttered, shouldn't he be the one feeling ashamed? He had asked Haley to kiss him. His gaze dropped when the girl leaned down and lightly brushed her lips against his. She was rushing, but she was very diligent, which made Roderick smile with self-satisfaction. Haley resentfully asked if he was laughing at her, which amused the king even more. Then, the protagonist hid under the sheets and announced in a distressed voice that she was going to sleep now. Roderick ruffled her hair and, struggling to suppress his laughter, begged her not to be angry. In the middle of the night, Roderick woke up noticing the girl's absence beside him. Eyes half open, he saw her sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, wearing only a nightgown. He immediately asked her what she was doing there. Turning around, the protagonist apologized to His Majesty, confused, for waking him up unintentionally. Haley explained that she was simply meditating, but the man picked her up in his arms and asked her to sleep a little longer, until dawn. The protagonist made a mistake, because she was sure she wouldn't wake him up. But in the end, the opposite happened. The girl just wanted to help the soul of a small child. The ghost was furious because, as before, no one could help him. So now, he was going to torture everyone. Roderick didn't understand how much longer. He could pretend not to notice Haley's lies. Zero progress with the protagonist's to-do list. And yesterday, she couldn't exorcise the ghost. But now what worries her most is going to the river, where Haley threw herself. It must have been near the temple in the capital. But to leave the castle, she needs a permit. So the girl made the decision to go see His Majesty. Upon exiting to the hallway, she bumped into the king, whose face lit up upon seeing her. Roderick told her he wanted to have lunch with her, and that they could take a walk first and chat a little. Actually, a guest arrived at the castle, and Roderick wanted to introduce him to his queen. The girl told him that she wanted to ask for permission to leave the castle. At first he agreed, but when the protagonist mentioned the temple, his face changed completely. He, indignant, immediately asked if she intended to keep taking him for an idiot. Of course, the king did not allow Haley to go to the temple. If she mentioned the temple again, the king would be forced to blind not only that river, but all the others. The protagonist wanted to explain, but Roderick asked her not to, so as not to anger him further. At that precise moment, a man appeared in front of them, a complete stranger to Haley. That man looked a lot like the king, so the girl wondered mentally who the hell he was. Roderick explained to the queen that this was his younger brother, named Edgar. The brothers looked very much alike, but the protagonist couldn't recall if he had met Haley before her death. At the table, Edgar said that his brother talked a lot about His Majesty, until he ran out of saliva. But in reality, Roderick complained so much because he fears that someone might seduce the queen. The protagonist, somewhat embarrassed, asked the prince to continue eating, but he only asked her to call him Edgar. Haley asked what he did, and the prince replied that, in reality, he only wandered around different places investigating. He even envied that freedom. The girl would also like to visit different places. With an offended look, the king replied that it was not good to make that face. If she desired to go so much, they could do it together. The king would even make time for it. But Haley wanted to go to the temple alone, that's for sure. The protagonist reminded him that she had already promised not to do any of that, so she wouldn't hurt herself. Edgar interrupted the conversation, suggesting that it was better to take a walk alone to change the scenery. No need to make a fuss at dinner. So the prince offered the lady that dish. Haley didn't even notice when she had time to decorate everything like that. The king asked the girl to eat a lot so that she could finally grow up. 3 days later, the curiosity of the nobility dissipated upon naming Prince Edgar commander of the western border area. As Roderick's representative, he ordered his brother to protect the kingdom from the remnants of the Daimon Empire army. Originally, Duke Duncan was the candidate for this position. The protagonist confessed to the king that her aura and her brother's were totally different. Roderick said that his brother was more erudite than him, and that, since childhood, he had been a bookworm. Haley didn't understand why sending someone like that to the border, but she was more intrigued as to why her father wanted to send him there. Although the king wanted to ask her the same question, Roderick revealed that the girl's hair color and other details indicate that her family descends from the Daimon Empire. In other words, Haley's lineage was the king's enemy. Immediately after, the king began to talk about every guest at the event and the value they represented. It looked more like a masterclass, but Haley didn't understand why Roderick was telling her all this. Since the Duncans are his enemies, the reason was that the king was sure that this girl would never betray him. The protagonist's heart filled with warmth, and she wished to always be by the side of that wonderful person. The day of the prince's departure ceremony arrived. Roderick regretted how things had turned out, but he promised his brother that he could return to what he loved when everything got better. He wasn't sending Edgar to the west to die there, so that, if something happened to him, his younger brother could take the reins of the country. The protagonist's eyes widened upon hearing those words. Haley didn't know what to do if the king thought something bad might happen to him. Terror took hold of the young woman's body as she entered His Majesty's bedchamber. Everything returned to normal, and the king's room filled with evil spirits again. The protagonist fell to her knees, not understanding why the talismans were useless. Everything had been in vain, and Haley's body and soul were at their limit. Roderick was startled by the young woman and quickly suggested calling a doctor. Then he noticed the broken statuette and was surprised, while tears ran down her face. The king thought he had done something wrong and immediately began to apologize. Roderick promised that even if they turned to dust, he would cherish them as long as she didn't cry. But Haley burst into even more tears, realizing that the statue called GJ was on the floor. Despair completely invaded her. Roderick immediately picked up the fragments and, confused, assured her that he would cherish them too. Since it didn't matter how they looked, he will cherish them, it's the most natural thing. Haley got up and the king, scared, asked her if she was really all right. He desperately begged her to tell him everything, promising not to hurt her. Forcing a smile, the protagonist replied that she was just a little tired and suggested going to sleep. It was an obvious lie on her part. At some point, waiting for King Roderick to fall asleep became a battle. Obviously, no one would sleep after seeing such a scene, but the protagonist had to endure it almost daily. But she couldn't understand how they could treat that person like that. Until her strength ran out, the protagonist was determined to fight until the victorious end. Yamra's statuette remains intact, and Haley won't fight empty-handed. The protagonist always wanted to go where not only her feet, but also her heart led her. But in reality, she was always and everywhere a wanderer, roaming desolate land. The human heart never hesitates, and Haley was determined to protect the king. Even aware of all the risks, the protagonist couldn't do anything about it. Her heart is still beating for him, and the young woman is incapable of resisting. One must not yield to darkness, and the heroine has no intention of doing so. As soon as the morning sunbeams illuminated the window, the king woke up and felt Haley on top of him. His eyes snapped open in panic when he slightly turned her. The young woman's face, including her hair and nightgown, were stained with crimson blood. Roderick immediately shouted to the guards to call the royal doctor to the room. The doctor determined that His Majesty was fine, but his symptoms were beyond mundane understanding. The protagonist let out a choked sound. The king also rushed to the bed, and the girl asked confusedly in a low voice why there were so many people in the room. She used amulets all night and expelled half the spirits, but then fainted. Haley was scared when she noticed that His Majesty was bleeding profusely. The man took her hand tenderly and explained that it was she who had been bleeding all along. He desperately begged the girl to tell him what the hell was wrong. Roderick was trembling because he was scared to see his loved one bleeding next to him. Moreover, Haley always tells him that he doesn't understand anything. Confused, she asked to go to her room, fearing that her words would worsen Her Majesty's mood. Roderick agreed, but decided to personally take the girl to her room. While the man carried her to the room, the protagonist lost consciousness again along the way. Now only she and he remained in the room. Roderick leaned over her and begged her to honestly tell him where she hurt and why all this was happening. If he knew the truth, he could protect her in some way. But Haley didn't want to tell anything, as she had barely managed to give that man peaceful nights. The king perfectly understood that revealing your weaknesses was very hard. But if the girl did it, he could protect her and fight by her side. The protagonist pouted, not understanding how much longer he intended to continue like this. She hated herself so much for not being able to tell everything honestly, feeling strange and disgusting. Therefore, Haley pushed the king away and desperately asked why he had to fight for her. She is strange, very different, and Roderick knows it well but still tries to know her essence. Her voice broke into a cry, and the girl asked him not to try to understand her, because it would be better that way. Haley is sure she won't stand it if the king also looks at her with that look. She herself learned to breathe so as not to die of pain. Simply, at that distance, the protagonist wants him to let her do something. The man took her hands and asked in a low voice how she could do that. Haley didn't even imagine with what face she was trying to push him away at that moment. He desperately begged her not to say such things about herself. She is still his wife after all. Roderick desperately promised that he would protect her at all costs if she was honest.